Hey everyone, Temporal here, and we are just about to get started. For those of you that don't know, we are doing a collab stream today with Spilo. Spilo is another coach in the Overwatch world. He has done quite a few contenders teams, most recently Sheer Cold, before that Uprising Academy, and then I worked with him on City Drop Bears Phase 2, etc. So all sorts of good stuff there. So we are about to go into a uh, sort of meta, how to read a meta, how to preview a meta, and a bit of a history lesson. And here we go.
Oh, long time no chat.
It has been a while. How you doing?
Doing pretty well. Doing pretty well. Chat. Let me know how the volume is because sometimes I tend to be a little quiet. But yeah, good to hear from you, man. Do you kind of want to give yourself a little bit of a shout out, like kind of like who you are, what you do, to
Sure,
chat,
sure.
and I can tell you, like where our relationship began a long, long, long time ago.
It did. So I am Temporal. I am a former contenders coach turned, I don't want to call it private coaching because much of what I do is public, but turned coach, we'll say, slash content creator. So these days I'm, just doing the content creation stuff, seeing a lot of VOD reviews out of me. If you're looking for the one-on-one stuff, the micro stuff, that's currently what I'm doing a lot of. But my
Sick.
history, Phase 2, Sydney Drop Bears, had a lot of fun, worked with Spilo on a couple of those teams, and it's been a blast.
Sick, sick, awesome. Well, I've known Temporal for literally years now since I first started getting into team coaching. On the second team I ever coached, and really the first time I actually coached
Yeah.
was Lividosity University, that High Masters team, and Temporal was the coach for the main team, the non-university team, the whole 4.3K team,
Oh,
and you know
oh.
and I came to you with all of my gameplay questions, question after question after question. You're always more than considerate and helped me out, really helped me out greatly learning the game. And then from there on to Chicken Contendies, turned, I guess, was it Grunto Esports, turned Third Impact down the road.
Hmm.
And then Sydney Drop Bears after that as well. And I'm still to this day incensed and offended that you never got the Overwatch League opportunity. But unfortunate, it is what it is. You've made your life choices, and you've done a lot of great things. And hey, you're back at least for a little bit, and we're glad to have you back. A
Absolutely.
lot of the reviews I thoroughly enjoy. I still watch them. And Chat, like I said, he's really, really, as he said, he does a lot of those one-on-one reviews. Great, great coach, and really was my coach for a long time, at least when it came to the game. So yeah, we had a plan, as I'm describing the chat, that we wanted to do a team coach. So you had a replay code of like some GM team, correct?
Yeah, no, we had a nice 4.4 lobby set up. It was going to be great. And then 20 minutes, 30 minutes before we were scheduled for this, it was, nah, we're going to drop the patch.
Yeah, so the patch dropped, and so did my heart, and that pretty much ended that idea. So the last second, I was like, "This is something I wanted to do for a while," but I was like, "I figure we're probably gonna have to make a video out of this."
Hmm.
I was not planning on streaming it for obvious reasons.
This is going to be fun on the spot, and people are going to call us
Yeah,
out when we totally forget about minor metas that happen. This will be great.
yeah. Thank you, Kelly, for the sub. I'll do a couple squats in a second. So the idea is what makes a meta is that we're going to discuss like what not just the individual metas specifically, but like on the grand scheme, what in Overwatch, what is it about Overwatch that lends itself towards making a meta, and then like how do you break that mold, like what kind of like what causes a meta to come about, and we'll talk about that. And then obviously like we'd like to go into the details of each meta, and not overly specific on the micro. We don't obviously don't have time for that,
Sure.
but just to touch on each of them, because I know you and I have both had opportunities to work with each of them and probably have different knowledge sets that will complement. And I think the first thing first is, do you kind of want to like explain like what is a meta for those of us that maybe aren't involved in competitive Overwatch? Like what is meta? Like what does it mean?
Sure. So meta is simply a calculation of, hey, how are people playing the game? And based on how people are playing the game, what is the strategy that we can think about? It's not just about the game itself, but it's also about outside of the game, what are people doing right now? So a meta can evolve even without patches changing, because a meta really is how are people playing the game? game. What is seeing use? How are people playing the game? What combination spheres? What combinations of abilities? How are people trying to win? And because you
Hmm.
can get some feel for that, like a meta might be, in the Overwatch world, 70% of teams are running something really tank heavy, 30% of teams are running, something very dive heavy. So what we want to do might be a calculation of it has to be able to beat this. It has to be more favored against a brawl heavy team than it does a dive heavy team, but it can't fold to that. And metas can evolve even without rule changes, even without patches to get to places, just because the way that the people out there are playing the game changes, which makes different things effective. Strategy A can beat B but not C, and it evolves like that. I'm sure you can do a
Exactly.
better description, but I really don't want to fall back on the backronym because it's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. I think like you said, it's as people's understanding evolves, and it doesn't even require a patch. I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes the patch can almost be psychological. Oh, this is 0.5% harder to accomplish this. Well, then clearly that's not the best strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And people will over exaggerate. But ultimately, I think what we've seen with Overwatch is, I mean, obviously, hindsight's 2020 here, so we'll see what I think in 6 months. But I think over time, I think especially with the fact that new heroes haven't been released, I think metas have become more stable. In other words, we see less wild swings from the left or to the right or forward or back, and people are starting to understand what is this hero good at, and more importantly, how is the game of Overwatch played? Like, what are the strengths and weaknesses of different things?
I think
We've
that's
got. Go ahead.
mostly true. I think that's probably mostly true, and you've done more team coaching more recently than me. I'm doing some, but never for long periods of time, etc. right now. And I think the counterbalance to that is, hey, we have been seeing faster balance changes than we did before. So we're seeing more
True.
patches. So, and each patch is sort of an excuse for people to like that. That,
Mhm.
that makes the spark, like you talked about, for people to try different things. So I don't know
Exactly.
if the metas are more stable now. Like that would be up for debate in my
So,
mind.
so, so, so when I sorry, let me clarify what I mean. When
Sure.
I mean more stable, I mean in regards to the meta being played is most likely a very strong composition and not
Ah,
likely just the flavor of the month. In other words,
sure.
as for example, like remember the was it the ice fishing composition for a while?
Yep.
I feel like it was like the Arissa Hog Hanzo. Like I felt like or May. I felt like that was not a really great composition.
It's
Um,
almost like we had the same thought, and that's why while other teams were playing that 25% of the time, we one
right.
tricked the other comp. It's
Right,
almost like that was
exactly.
a thing.
I
Anyway,
know, I know, and it paid off. But it felt like a lot of some of these compositions, it's like that feel like that comp isn't that good. It's just not. It's just like nobody has any better ideas right now.
right.
So, and I think as people start to understand, and you and I are both people that harp on map control and angles a lot. We can kind of start to look at how these metas lived and died from those set of glasses, right?
Sure.
And also obviously like the heroes that make up those. So I think one thing to set us off before we start looking at the individual things is what makes a meta. For me, I always look at who are the really dominant heroes in Overwatch? Like, who are the really strong heroes, whether it's their nerfs and buffs, whatever. Who are the heroes that are really, really strong? And then I think once you answer that question, whether it's one hero or two or three or even four, you then need to find heroes that complement that hero properly. For example, we'll talk, I'm sure, more about it later, but we had a Winston, Reaper, Sombra, Diva, Moira, Lucio meta for a while. And I don't think anybody thinks Moira is overpowered, at least anybody over
Sure.
Platinum.
Sure.
And you look at Winston's certainly not overpowered. But at that point in time,
Oh, he might
Sombra,
be. We might change our tune on that a year
well,
from now. But go
right,
ahead.
right. But at that point in time, right,
Sure.
at least not perceived as OP. But and same thing to an extent. Diva might be a little overtuned, but it was Sombra. Sombra was so very dominant that you ended up playing heroes with either escape cooldowns,
Mm-hmm.
ways of counterplaying EMP, and then heroes that enabled their Sombra to farm or disabled the enemy Sombra. And so you saw like a meta evolve around that hero. With all the double shield metas that we saw, double shield, double shield, double shield, double shield. Well, a lot of that, Brig got scapegoated. A lot of the spam DPS got scapegoated. But ultimately, I think you kind of looked at Orisa Sigma as being a extremely strong tank duo
So,
that other tank duos kind of stroll. So when
sure.
I see meta, I see a couple of heroes that are just really strong, and people pick heroes around that hero to fit them. And so I've always said my like little soundbite is that a hero can have, in pro level anyway, a 70-80% pick rate and not be considered overpowered.
So I think I'm with you like 70-80% of the way that is sort of what contributes to a meta, because it's again based on what everyone is playing, and what everyone is playing is sparked by, hey, what one or two heroes are overtuned compared to the rest of the cast. But I think the missing piece there, and you probably think about this, it probably just didn't come out, is what are pro players comfortable with playing? And what I mean by that is, how do they know how to play the game? Dive, for example, stuck around for so long and everything was forced into Dive in some ways because, hey, they know how to play comps that do this type of thing. And then, when
Right.
snipers came along, okay, we know how to do this thing. And actually, a good example would be the May Reaper comp and ice fishing that came
Right.
out. May Reaper sort of came along. Was that really the best way to play the game right then? Honestly, probably not. But
No.
players were very comfortable with how to play brawl heavy comps, and that was the best brawl heavy comp available. So there's
Right.
something to be said for, hey, we're gonna take the thing that works on the skill sets we need, because the metas take time to evolve, and it's just too big a shift off of a patch to go, hey, now the best hero in the game is something that's never been played. Oh shoot, how do we make this work?
Right. So we could describe metas as almost being sticky,
Yep.
or in terms of play style. Like people will pick up a play style and they want to play that play style and they don't want to leave it until it's absolutely trash. We went from, like goats to essentially double shield goats for a little while. In a lot of ways, in terms of like the brawlier play style. And even though double shield made a comeback, it showed up, spam that late that fall, early that winter, pretty quickly afterwards, once we saw the first round of nerfs, it instantly reverted back to Ryan Diva, Reaper May, Kree Lucy, more Ana Lucio, whatever, for several months.
Yeah.
So, and then again, when that's nerfed, we're not going back to dive. We're going to go back to double shield. So people kind of, like you said, like they're comfortable with a play style. They want to play that play style, and that's not a dig on the pro players. It's just psychological. People have a comfort zone, and ultimately, like when you're considering professional Overwatch, where people only have a couple weeks of getting good at something, they want to get so good at something that won't take an entire new revamping of how they approach something.
Exactly.
So I think that's kind of wraps up that discussion, unless you have anything else to add.
No, I think we can move from here.
So we can start, I guess this is something that I'm less familiar with, because honestly, at this point in time, I was just probably like silver gold, watching Overwatch League like once a week and going, oh, Pog, Genji Blade,
Sure.
I don't have no idea what was going on. So early Overwatch League metas, what were we looking at here that you can remember?
Are we talking Overwatch League or are we talking professional Overwatch? Because if we start with Overwatch League, Moth was pretty much the first serious thing we saw.
Let's start with Overwatch League, because before then it gets shady and there's just so many of them. So.
Sure, that's fine. So really in Overwatch League, the first thing that we saw that really had power was the Moth meta. I mean, we were looking at that and we were going, hey, this Mercy is really, really overtuned. She had more heals per second, I believe, than she did now. Her Valk gave her extra charges of res. Her Valk lasted longer. Like, this was a powerful hero. And the thing that people liked about that, of course, was that Mercy being powerful was something that enabled a lot of heroes who might not otherwise have seen play. Like we saw Junkrat was considered powerful back then. We saw Mercy was a pretty flexible meta in terms of her ability to pocket, made almost anyone she could pocket almost force their way into more viability than we'd have seen in pretty much any other situation. So that was really the first meta. And, mostly people ended up playing Dive with it, because Dive was sort of the history of what had come before that when we're talking sticky metas. And they were the heroes that made sense. I mean, there was things like longer contests on carts than we have now, etc., less total sustain in the game. But Mercy was really sort of the key to that working, plus some, hey, previous metas were Dive. Dive is still something we know how to play, and Dive is still relatively good.
Right. Now, at that meta, I distinctly remember Junkrat had no fall off in his concussion mine, so he could basically two-tap somebody instantly without even having to aim.
So he had recently been buffed to get the second mine charge and to have a faster tire than he has now as well. So that, combined with players not yet being, his tire before that had been really, really quite slow by today's standards. And at that time, it went to a speed that's even faster than the one we have now. So again, that skill that people don't have, that tire was particularly effective because people just weren't used to the speed yet, even at the pro level. And it got worse and it got patched to slow down.
Right. Now, what made Mercy strong at that point in time? Because I feel like when it's Moth meta, it's not spam meta or half dive meta. It's literally Mercy meta. That was the name. She was 100% pick rate. I remember at that point we started leaking down into rank, because at that point I was like a gold
Mm-hmm.
main tank player, and everyone wanted a Mercy. Everybody wanted a Mercy. What
Oh,
was
absolutely.
powerful about her?
So what was really powerful about her is the number of reses that she could get off was pretty insane. Like, remember, originally res was a mass res, ultimate, etc., but she went
Right.
from that to being able to go, okay, she's got res on a cooldown, she can pop a res, she can Valk, and then by the end of the Valk, she potentially has another res so that she can line up there. So you're looking at like 3 reses in one team fight, and I'm sorry, that's just insane. Like, Overwatch
Yeah,
is a
that was nuts.
6v6 game, team man advantage is huge. We all know man, like, when we come of the tiers of Overwatch, we could argue whether man advantage or position advantage is bigger, but it's a big deal, and they're both
Yeah,
bigger
it
than
is.
ult advantage. So going, well,
Yes.
usually. So going, no, we have 3 extra lives is just, well, okay.
No, was
Yeah.
the res instant as well? I can't remember.
It was instant during Valk, if memory serves. I could be
Okay.
misremembering there. It's been a while.
Okay.
But even the current res, it's not. Res isn't a
No.
terribly long ability, and it's not that hard to cover with tanks, etc. And it's not that hard to cover when you're mostly playing with dive heroes that can immediately get to spots and deny spots that
Right.
they need to.
Right. Right. Okay. So that's obviously busted.
Yes.
And what followed that? Like, what broke that? And was it goats after? Was there any like?
No. Well, actually, so what happened is we saw she got hit pretty hard with nerfs. So you were looking at, a maximum of 2 reses. It was hard to get. Then she got down to eventually, hey, Valk doesn't do anything to your res charges. We saw some Valk time shortening. We saw really all of those things that we talked about were, hey, she had multiple res charges. Hey, she had a longer lasting Valk. Hey, she actually had, faster movement speed, etc. We saw all of that stuff brought down by Blizzard finally for the 4th stage, I believe, of Owl there,
Right.
and that
Right.
was able to mostly do it. You certainly still saw Mercy be played, but it wasn't Mercy anymore. We went into snipers as the meta at that point. We started going, hey,
Oh
let's run
yeah.
Hanzo Widow. So Mercy's still seeing play, and people know how to use a Mercy, and Mercy enables those heroes quite well, but we went into snipers, and part of that was, hey, we brought down Mercy, so she's just not making everything out ridiculous anymore. And also we got Briggs released. So when we got Brig, that meant, oh hey, even with the rudimentary version of her that no one knew how to play, etc., it was suddenly a big kick to dive. And dive was most of the history, etc., but dive was most of the history of play. So we didn't immediately
Right.
move to tanks at that point because, hey, Mercy doesn't work at all with tanks. Like, Mercy does not
Right.
work in brawl comps, etc. But it's this, hey, we can't play dive anymore. Mercy is still pretty good. We all know how to play Mercy, etc. Let's move into this double poke where we're controlling
Right.
2-3 angles with our double snipers, Hogarissa type thing.
So you're thinking that Brig maybe on release meant that, hey, I don't like playing Genji and Tracer with this dive anymore. But I can definitely still play snipers. And kind of like, it was, in other words, Brig disabled dive, didn't quite disable dive, but she definitely disabled dive DPS from being attractive. A lot of that stage.
She definitely disabled dive DPS from being attractive, but what was really interesting about her is she was a shadow pick. No one had to run a Brig for the entirety. Like, sometimes Brig was run, but no one actually had to run her, because you'll notice what we're talking about is we're talking a Hanzo Widow, and then, of course, with that, you're going to run a Mercy Zed,
Right.
something along those lines. No one actually has
Right.
to pick the Brig for Brig to do what she did to sort of dumpster
Right. It's the
dive as an
fear.
option. Because,
Right.
exactly, she was in a place and she was so overtuned that she countered dive effectively by herself. So it becomes
Right.
if you swap to dive, which is 4 hero swaps, we're going to say we get to swap 1 hero from our poke comp and we beat you. And you just can't maintain ult economies when that's the case. So you had to play poke into it, or you could have brawled, but that's the game. People didn't know how to brawl. The only brawl we'd seen at that point in the history of Overwatch really was the original Ninjas in Pajamas triple tank ages ago.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So my question for you, to get your opinion on this, is that we
Please.
talked about, the double snipers and etc. Now, I distinctly remember this was right about the time when I was seriously grinding, Moth, when I was like right in the tail end. And I distinctly remember in ranked, we had a period of time where it was Ryan. This is ranked, keep in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, Zarya, Hanzo, Zen, Mercy, Brig.
Yeah.
And I remember it was damage boosted Grav Dragon over and over and over again. And I distinctly remember that being the meta.
Mm-hmm.
It made me quit playing main tank. I became a flex support man after that,
So,
because Ryan was miserable because you could just bash through shield and etc. And you literally could not play monkey.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was when you could damage boost Dragon, and Hanzo had just gotten Stormbow
Mm-hmm.
and Lunge. I'm trying to remember all of like what happened there with Hanzo.
So that did happen. If memory serves, that was a ladder only meta. I don't recall if that was because it was like between stages when we had a break, so it was being run on ladder before we saw what happened in stage 4, or if it was a case of no. I think what it was is stage 4 was run on a previous patch, then the ladder was being run on. So the ladder was having to run its own independent meta. And yes, that very much happened. That was a meta, and yes, it was hey, Hanzo got his massive rework. Hanzo got his massive rework, and its Grav Dragon plus Mercy boost is really powerful. Mercy was still okay. She wasn't the monster that she was before. Excuse me. It wasn't, she wasn't the monster that she was before, but she was still powerful. And yes, that was one of those rare times when we're using heavy frontline tanks with Mercy comp, etc. And sometimes that comp was played pretty balled up. I think these days that comp would run into serious issues, but again, people are better at Overwatch than they were back then.
Right. And I think the key thing too is like the ability to damage boost through Grav Dragon. It's like you wanted, like I know sometimes it's like you couldn't really run Brig Mercy consistently with a Reinhardt. Even then, it wasn't quite enough healing, so you wanted that other support. But then, it was always a guessing game of, should I trance this Grav Dragon? Is this going to actually heal, or is it just going to might instantly get nuked? This wasn't even talking about pinning out a Grav or isolating with bubbles. You didn't have to do anything. You just had to go just damage boost Dragon. I just did it by itself.
No, and Grav tended to be a more powerful ult back then. Like, we really got a lot
it had a
better.
Bigger suction. It had a bigger suction.
There's that, but even before that, yes, it did. It had a bigger suction that it pulled people in. It was effectively a bigger ult. It more consistently led to teamfight wins. But remember, during Goats, we did a lot to develop Grav strategies even before Grav got nerfed. Like, there was Grav effectively got worse because so much effort was invested in figuring out, what do we do, to the point where Grav was not considered the best non-support ult in Goats by the end of it, even before it got nerfed.
Right. Give me 1 second, Temporally.
By all means.
Okay, sorry. So then I think we're coming right up on where, at least post Overwatch League, we start to see. Well, actually, we saw a little bit of Orisa towards the end of that Overwatch League, did we not?
We did, and the reason we saw the Orisa was because we moved on to that heavy poke comp, and while Orisa hadn't really been run before that, we did get to see, really the first good Orisa we got to see. I'm totally blanking. I want to say it was London's Orisa, who just had great halts. Gesture, yes. For that period in time, just had great halts that were doing huge amounts to enable those dragon strikes, because again, there's no Grav. So it was like, here's our little Grav, and it effectively was, but most people weren't any good at halt usage by then. So that was the first time we really saw Orisa see play. She'd been out for a while at that point, but that wasn't a hero. Poke hadn't been the meta, etc. at any point before then.
Right. And that makes sense. It's funny that we see Orisa, but then immediately afterwards, I think we see the, Overwatch League ends, double snipers over, and then, freaking Goats.
Contenders.
What was it? Was it Hanamura? I think it was Hanamura Attack, correct?
The first time Goats brought out Goats? Map. Yeah, I think going into, I don't remember if it was going into second or going into first, but it was, some situation where it's like, well, okay, what do we do? And, that was the moment where it's like, okay, they just run all these but they run all these heroes together and they just get value. And it's nothing like what we recognize as Goats today in terms of how they played it, but it kind of worked. It was like, hey, there's a stupid amount of sustain here when we combine all these heroes.
Yes. It was so basically people looked at that situation and they said, we're playing a meta that was very much, I think it was the first time, at least professional Overwatch that I know of, had delved that heavily into map control and angle control with double snipers. Like I remember watching an Arrow review, I think specifically on Dorado, and being blown away at how advanced the mind games and controlling angles and timing.
And then we threw it all out.
And then you throw it all out. And then you go into Goats meta where it's like, okay, well, we are playing a meta where we just don't care. Like we might clear a high ground, but mostly we're just going to sit on cart and just out sustain. And I think that's what made Goats originally so broken. Is people talk about old economy and things like that, and those were contributing factors to the big busted point, which was you didn't care about map control as Goats. I mean, in the mirror, of course, you matter, but like against most any composition, at least at its beginning, Goats just didn't care. It could outsustain any map advantage that you could have.
Well, it needed to. I mean, it couldn't. The very concept of the comp is such that you can't possibly control things because it was so heavily invested in peel, and most of its
Right.
peel was pretty short range. So they just went, we
Right.
will stack all of the peel in the game, and if we spread out, we can't stack that peel. We lose to
Right.
dive if we spread out. So that's not going
Right.
to work
Right.
for us.
Right. So it would stack, it'd play for objective, it would play for time, it would play the time game really, and just say, you know what, we might lose a bunch of fights to spamming out or losing map control, but we're going to come back, but we're fast, we're quick, and we have like essentially an ult eco that can't be beat by anything. You know, we're laughing at your Dragon Strike and at your Infrasight and at your Primal Rage. We have a Rally. We have, you know, a Diva Bomb. We have a Graviton. We have, you know, a Sound Barrier. We're not going to lose to anything that you throw to us once we get old eco, and then it starts to cycle and cycle, and you're never losing a fight.
I mean, mostly there's some ult eco that they could lose to, and we did see people try it, but the problem is you just lose too much of the map when you do it. We saw Pharmacy Hanzo for a while to try to battle it. We saw Cyber Dive. We saw some Doomfist Sombra stuff, and you can win fights, you can even win matches, but you can't win tournaments like that.
Right. Yeah. It was messy. So we saw Goats for a long time, and then I guess Goats, I always like talk about, like, this is, I think, a good example of a meta that was counterintuitive to what people wanted to play. So it was not comfortable. One of the few metas where the transition was awkward, but it was a meta that, number one, revolved around abusing a game mechanic, right? Just like the core mechanics of the game. And it was most importantly, or not, maybe not most importantly, but also importantly, revolved around the broken aspects of one hero. Now, you can make arguments that there are other heroes in Goats that were strong as well. I'm sure Lucio was strong. Diva was certainly strong. But Rein Zarya, nobody cared about Rein Zarya. Nobody, like, Zen was relatively strong, but Zen wasn't even part of original Goats. Now, Moira was stronger than she was now, but nobody played Moira. You know,
you weren't playing Moira Goats after the first few months, yeah.
And right, exactly. So you're talking about an entire composition that revolved around Brig. And because Brig's sustain anti-dive was so strong, and obviously Rally at that time was, I mean, you can make an argument, was the strongest ultimate in the game.
Make an argument? I'm struggling to think of things that are, support ults generally are better. You know, those support ults that can be used defensively or offensively are almost all top 5 ults, and she probably had the best because of permanent armor.
Right, permanent armor and armor at the time that people didn't realize. I don't know how you program a game, but it was broken. It was, was it double or triple strength for months and months, like 6 months. Like the added armor was stronger than normal armor. And so you talk about a hero where you just press Q and you literally can't die, and you can literally kill anything, and you just press W, and there you have, there's Brig. And so they exploited the mechanic of, like we talked about, sustaining and surviving and playing on old eco, and then it revolved around Brig. So I think this is a good example of what we talked about, where sometimes when you look at a meta, you'll see a hero that has 100% pick rate, but you don't nerf the hero. I remember they
Brig did not have the highest pick rate, which was the funny thing, because you would see some of the variants replace her, but she was the glue that held it together because, well, she was much of that.
Exactly. If you saw anything other than Goats in the matchup, you'd instantly go Brig. Kind of like what you're saying with Brig's threat preventing dive DPS from being played. Well, Brig's threat prevented anything other than Goats being played. And the thing about Brig too is, like, it was frustrating to me watching this. And I'm not a genius developer, and I won't always criticize developer decisions because I think they do a genuinely pretty good job. Yeah. However, Brig was one of the frustrating aspects for me watching, because at that point I was more involved with coaching and understanding the game. And I see buffs to Reaper, and I see buffs to Mei, and I see buffs to Hanzo, and I see buffs, and I see nerfs to Lucio, and I see nerfs to Zen, and I see nerfs to, who did they else say they nerfed? They nerfed Zarya, I think. I think they nerfed Diva as well. And I'm like, wait, what are you guys doing? They're not the problem, because
I think there's politics involved there. I think that unfortunately there was politics involved there. But go ahead.
So my thought process is, like, you only have so many supports in the game, like Lucio, Zen. You know, Ana, you can't nerf those guys really, because if they're not, they're going to be played in other comps as well. So you're nerfing the other comps as well. And the same argument can be applied to Rein, Diva, and Zarya as well. Like, this played in Dive, that's played in other Brawl comps. And
so the thing is, they did give her they did give her some nerfs along the way, but they
Right.
were always small. They were never some
They
of
were
the
always
things that
small.
we've seen in other places where, Genji
Right.
got dumpstered after he got buffed up. They were never
Right.
like, hey, this is what changed. We had a game that mostly worked, mostly people understood. This is clearly what changed, but we don't want to, they were never going to delete her. That wasn't a thing that they were going to
Right.
do. But they were very hesitant to quickly take power away from her, which was
Right.
unfortunate in some ways. I mean, I liked
Right.
coaching
Right.
Goats, but for the health of the game, for the viewership, for the people continuing to play, probably not the best. But we're in,
No.
yeah.
No. And I think this is also where we hear this catchphrase a lot, and we don't have to get down that rabbit hole, but like I think this is where the first confirmed appearance of what has been best described as power creep really started to kick in, because we see where Blizzard misapplied developer attention is like the key phrase I've written here. And it's like where they see a problem, and instead of saying, okay, Brig is too strong, or we need to kick this 2-2-2 discussion off really seriously, instead we buff DPS and we buff DPS and we buff DPS and we buff DPS and we buff
Well,
DPS. And then what happens is then we see Brig is, either 2-2-2 is whatever is locked,
mm-hmm.
and now you've got these monster DPS that were
Mm-hmm.
never enough to overcome Brig, were never enough to overcome the mechanics of full tanks and full supports, but now it's no longer an option. You've got poor Winston having to deal with Reaper May, and he never had to deal with that before.
Sure.
And you can go down the list of the DPS cast almost at least as of a year ago. I think 90% of the DPS cast had received significant buffs since their release.
So,
significant.
I think unfortunately that is just a side effect of the era of game development we're in, where everyone wants to go, hey, we're releasing something new, and the new thing has to be more exciting than the old stuff.
True.
So to be more exciting, it has to be more powerful. You could go to collectible card games where it's like, hey, the new cards are better than the older cards. You could go to, sort of anything, and you have to do a bit of that. Maybe you don't have to. I would prefer that they didn't. But I understand the ecosystem that a developer feels they're in, because I do not think Brig was the first example of that. I go on and I look at, hey, Anna was the first example of that. If you look at Anna, and Anna was the first hero released. If you look at what Anna's nade does, it heals, it does damage, it accelerates the healing received, and it, what was I trying to say? And it prevents healing from happening. That's 4 different things that we've pumped into one ability. What ability of Reaper does 4 different things? What ability of Reinhardt does 4 different... You see where I'm saying? Where it was like, we had that really from the very beginning. And I think it's just, it was super obvious with Brig, but that's because Brig was clearly released as a, hey, supports are not having fun. We've been in Dive for 9+ months, etc. And Dive, even though Dive at a pro level had sort of evolved to a, we're going to punish the tanks, not the supports, that hadn't trickled all the way down the ladder, so Dives were still happening on support. Supports weren't having fun. Blizzard felt they had to do something, and that's why we got very self-peel heavy supports in Moira, in Brig, etc.
That makes sense. Now, I will say one thing, just on a side note. I think that a lot of times we scapegoat new heroes as being a problem, and I agree that Nade and Ana, I'm sure, was like crazy at the time. But like, you also have to look at the heroes that you like, the early developer heroes, like Reaper. We look at Ryan, we look at Bastion, we look at Junkrat, we look at Symmetra. Especially on their release, their abilities were just boring. Soldier as well.
Sure.
Just boring. They didn't do anything. So like, you have to find the balance, I think, of making abilities that are jack of all trades, do too much, completely busted, but also abilities that actually take some thought to use. Because when I had my whole collaboration with SVB and we talked about skill floor, there were a lot of the early first release heroes that were very low in the skill floor.
Absolutely.
Like, way more. And I think that's an interesting side effect. I don't know if it was just, hey, that we have to keep this game simple, to get people involved. But since then, we've seen abilities that are arguably stronger, but also have more complexity behind them. So it's like a good and a bad thing, I guess. So like, what is the, so like, I guess the next logical step for Goats was, we see some additional nerfs, and I think we can bring this up simultaneously. We see DPS, like, the Shengdu Hunters. Everybody thinks of, Shengdu, the Hunters. And then we see Sombra Goats. And do you want to talk about those, like, too?
So Sombra Goats, okay, I mean, we can talk about Sombra Goats. Sombra Goats happened where we could stick the Sombra in there. Sombra Goats had some nice stuff where, hey, EMP is also one of the most powerful ults in the game, and we can get a lot of value out of having our Sombra, etc. I think, we both know that ultimately it proved not to be the king of goats, but we definitely did see it for a while. I think some of that was honestly just frustration of, hey, we want to do something that isn't goats, and some of that was teams feeling like we're so far behind, Goats lasted so long and went so deep that teams were
Yep.
trying to find a way to cheat, a shortcut. Like,
Yep.
no, I want to change the game. I want the game to be different. I want to make you play a different game because you, San Francisco Shock, you, Eagle Gaming, you, whatever, are just too far ahead. So we're
Right.
going to try to, rather than catch up on that ladder because you are 2 ladders ahead of me, let me try and build a different ladder. And it didn't
Mhm.
work, but I understand totally why teams did it.
Right, and it worked to an extent for the teams that like. I mean, nobody won Overwatch League with Sombra Goats necessarily, but
Hmm.
like we still saw, I mean, what is it? Shanghai beat San Francisco Shock on a stage
Sure.
with Sombra Goats. I think San Francisco Shock didn't play it super well, but there was an idea, and ironically, like I guess we could touch on this really quickly as well. We're kind of overloading ourselves with categories, but a lot of the time the Sombra Goats almost forced teams that didn't know how to play goats into the proper playstyle of goats. In other words, map control,
Yes.
angles, playing it slow. A lot of these teams are in the mindset, and it's always like this a lot of times, especially with Brawl metas on
Hmm.
first release. Just press mouse one, guys, W all together. Come on, like, right? But as teams get better, they understand like you can't force a kill on the Rhine. He's going to S key out with speed, and the Diva's going to screw your backline, and Zarya's going to be a million charge, and they're going to build better ults and put more pressure, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
Anybody in my chat understands the value of angles, and that was no less valuable with a Brawl comp. It's
Hmm.
just as valuable as it was with the spam comp. So when you involve the Sombra on an angle, you're like, hey, this is pretty good. We have to play slow for EMP. We have to play slow for hacks. And it kind of forces you to play in the way that you should have been playing if you were playing goats properly. What are
Into
your
the
thoughts
mirror,
on that?
yes. I think into
Yeah.
the mirror, that's true. And I think it was hard for teams that weren't really good at goats to understand, oh, shoot, how do we deal with this angle, et cetera, because people
Right.
were not understanding, hey, you need someone threatening another angle. Like, you need to
Yes.
have a Diva up threatening another angle, or a Zarya threatening another angle, or you need to set it up so that you have a concave that they're pressing into, et cetera, because people had been thinking of it as we're our blobs behind our Rhine shields that we push into each other.
Right.
Again, that's
Right.
the right answer against poke because you need the extreme peel. That's the right answer against dive because you need the extreme peel. But Goats doesn't have the mobility to get on
Right.
top of your lone heroes. So you actually want to go, if you get on top of my lone heroes, I can shoot you in the back,
Right,
etc.
exactly. And we kind of saw the development of that is when people figured out how to play DPS into goats. And obviously, again, that was even worse than Sombra Goats, arguably. I know it's a popular thing on Reddit that, oh yeah, get goats was on the way out before 222. It really wasn't. Some teams were finding success with it, but it all would
One
revolve
team
around
found success for, one tournament. Okay.
right,
Okay.
exactly. But one DPS really rose to the forefront, or two DPS really. Sombra, the one that can play wherever she wants,
Hmm.
um, and Pharmacy, who also can play wherever she wants. What are your thoughts on that? Like, and how that contributed to Goats struggling a little bit?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you pretty much hit it. Sombra had some ability, some success to play where she wanted. Hey, she can teleport out, etc. I mean, Goats teams did get good at going, okay, well, we still do have extreme peel. We can block off your Goats team while we force your Sombra out and then run you over. Like, Goats teams did figure that out, etc. When we're talking about Sombra Goats. When we're talking about the other stuff, she did do a good job because hey, she could exist, etc. And that worked pretty well. That's always what it was about. But it was hardly the first time teams had been trying that. I mean, we'd been seeing
Right.
Farah Hanzo comps, for example, for ages that had been trying to crack open goats because those were two of the most extreme sources of damage before we buffed everyone's damage through the roof. And
Right.
it just didn't work. And they were holding angles, they were holding high ground, they were doing all of it, and it just wasn't enough. I think what ultimately happened there is yes, we got the fair, and that was a big deal. And I actually think the breakthrough that happened for the other comp was, hey, we can actually, at a high enough skill level, so, near the top of the Overwatch League, we could actually get enough value out of our Widowmaker's damage to make this work. So it was like, hey, that was the change, the more consistent one-shots, because that was ultimately the team that did the most run for the money in Stage 3 there, where it was like, hey, we're running Pharah plus Widowmaker, and then we'll mix in a Doom and Orisa, maybe a Hog instead of the Doom, etc.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And then I guess two hits, and everybody breathes a sigh of relief. And what was it? Was that right when ice fishing came out?
Yeah, so it
Remembering?
happened, and I like to think that because Phase 2 had been showing Reaper and memeing on some teams before 222 got released, everyone went, Reaper's right here to play. I'm kidding. Okay.
Yeah. Listen, Paris second. We were giving people like Vietnam flashbacks, trying to attack into our Paris second.
Oh, yeah.
With That was
Okay,
fun.
so it was. So ice fishing came at the same time. We had goats nerfed, and that immediately went, okay, well, what do we do? Well, of course, we're going to run Diva because everyone always runs Diva. Yeah, that's going to make sense. We're going to run Hanzo because Hanzo never really got nerfed from his strength
No.
before we found goats of this, hey,
Yeah.
you got Storm Arrow, you got your little fluffy leap. He'd been one of
Right.
the best DPS in the game
I
before
mean,
goats. Might as well go right back
he
to him. Go ahead.
right. He was like one of the heroes. Like he was just awful against ghosts because even though he had the high damage, he was very easy to rush. He was very easy to zone. He was relatively mobile, but not near as mobile as something like a Sombra, a Pharmacy, or even a Soldier. And unlike Widow, he couldn't just sit a trillion miles away and just
Mm-hmm.
ping, ping, ping. And his ultimate was worthless against ghosts, almost completely. Like very, very hard to get value out of that. So, um, now that that was gone, you see him back. And then what else did we see here? With like I can't remember that was it
So,
Orisa?
yeah, so ice fishing would happen with the Orisa Hog Hanzo May. That was what ended up getting run for the ice fishing. And then at the same time, I'd say the more dominant meta, while that was a comp that saw play on some maps, etc., the more dominant meta at that time was the Reaper May Orisa Diva. So
Right.
Orisa was the prime tank that was being run, etc., in this era. And honestly, I don't remember if Orisa had received buffs going in. I don't, or if Ryan had received nerfs at the same patch that brought us 222. I don't remember quite what led us to that. I suspect it was just a case of, hey, we need to maintain some level of poke if we're running Reaper May, etc. But I could be
Hmm.
wrong.
I do
Ultimately,
also remember that like the entire meta revolved around that pole as well.
for
So
ice fishing, yes. I'd say it's debatable. I'd fight you a little more on that with
sure.
the Reaper May comp, but
Right. Well, no, I agree. I agree with that. I think with the Reaper May comp, it was more along the lines of, "Oh, I'm gonna be dead instantly against this comp."
right.
Um,
So it was who
you're
has
gonna
the
struggle a lot more.
defensives. Yes.
Right.
It was very much, hey, and we found this out. It's, hey, we found this out before other teams, which led to the success of, hey, use our tank cooldowns to force CPS cooldowns, and then we win because everyone had an
Right.
invulnerability cooldown.
Right, right. So you look at this and you're like, okay, there's a more spam version of like the Orisa Diva comp, and there's a more brawl version of the Orisa Diva comp. Why Reaper May? Why? Like obviously we talked about how Orisa was relatively strong here, but
Hmm.
like was it just do you think that this meta was really truly one of a strong meta at the time,
No,
or do you think something like a pokier comp or a divier comp at the time would have done okay into?
No, I think a poke comp might have been the right answer at the time, to be perfectly honest. I think good angle control, a poke comp, I think you could have run that very effectively with like, hey, we're going to do this, etc. But I think this is where we hit the stickiness of, hey, people knew how to play Brawl, people knew how to do that thing, and being able to go, hey, we have this Reaper May thing is going to be it. And even when people are running ice fishing, they weren't taking aggressive angles with it. Ice fishing was
No.
sort of like a crossbow type thing. It wasn't, hey, let's have our hog in one place and our Hanzo in another and our Zen Orisa on a third sight line. It was, nope, we've mostly got our Hanzo shooting through our Orisa shield, and okay, now we hit the hook wall so that they can't get him
Yeah.
back, etc.
You know what? Actually, now that you mentioned that, I remember at that time that was when I was um, trialing with a couple of like just kind of shopping, right? And man, everybody did play that thing stacked up. Like, I mean, just
Mm-hmm.
one giant clump.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I look at these heroes like Mercy and Hanzo and Hog, and I'm like, there's no way that you play that. Yeah, and
You'd
that's
see
how it
the
was.
very occasional exception. Like I remember during that meta attacking into Volskaya first, or maybe we were defending Volskaya first, and it's like, oh, we're actually just going to defend with double snipers. Yay!
Right,
Because it was impossible to break. It's like you can't do that with the May Reaper comp or the Hanzo ice fishing comp. Like neither would
right,
work. But
right,
anyways.
right, right. So when you look at like Poke beating this Orisa Diva Reaper May Morilusu, I think like I don't know if nobody tried or it just was unsuccessful. People were still in that brawlier mindset, and I think what eventually happened is you looked at the Orisa Diva Reaper May, and two things happened.
Mm-hmm.
Number one, people looked at it and were like, okay, is May really all that useful? Because you have a hero that can Orisa who fortified doesn't give a rip about walls, he doesn't
Mm-hmm.
give a rip about freeze. Diva who's going to eat your ult and who
Mm-hmm.
doesn't is not going to get frozen. Reaper who can shift, Moira who can shift, Luz who's never going to get frozen. So you look at May and like, hey, this is pretty good at taking space, but she doesn't do a whole lot. And I think that's where we started to see what I call the meta specific pick,
Mm-hmm.
like the Zenyatta and Goats, where not Doom is not good against anything other than that comp, but against that comp, his own comp, he was good.
Yep.
And then along similar lines, you look at Diva. Well, she doesn't do a whole lot. If there's no May ult to eat, she's not going to do a whole lot. And even something like eating Reaper ult wasn't as valuable because you had a bunch of heroes that weren't really scared of Reaper ult. And obviously at this point in time, we're talking about another very infamous hero at Overwatch's release, which was Sigma.
Yep.
So I mean, this is kind of when we started to kind of go our separate ways, but what were your thoughts on this meta's dominance, this meta's legitimacy?
So I'm going to have to lean on you here more than I'd like, because I was gone at this point. After the Reaper May meta, I stuck around. I looked for, hey, Overwatch League, etc. I did some stuff and I looked at contenders and I could see the format change. And my take at the time was, it's clear to me with a little bit of insider knowledge that the money isn't where it needed to be for this space to grow, etc. So I actually took off and, focused on other work, other things, etc. So I've gone back and seen a little bit of this stuff, but I have not dedicated the time that I would like to be like, okay, during my gap year, we'll call it, I understand everything that happened. And that's not me, and I don't think that's necessary either. So I'm gonna have to lean on you a little harder here. But but I mean, it makes sense as an evolution that we go, okay, if we're not running the May, because the May was really just giving us initiation and an ability to survive herself with her, ice block, etc. We go ahead and get the Doomfist. That works well. Doomfist has problems into lots of other comps, particularly if Tracer exists. But then, okay, once the Doomfist is in play, the Diva makes less sense. Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. And then we get to Sigma. So go ahead.
Right. And I think Sigma's release was like the first of, I think people were playing him. I mean, I know I read him wrong initially. This was before I feel like I fully understood Overwatch. And, we see shield stacking. Everybody's mostly stacking. And it was literally very similar to ice fishing in the fact that how most teams played it, it was really just a cycle of cooldowns and hope something good happens. You pull punch, you pull TP, you go in with your, pull rocket, and you hope something happens. You hope you get a pick. You make a favorable cooldown trade. And then I think some of the better teams were starting to realize, hey, if we stage our Doomfist a little better, he doesn't have to pull punch. He can go pull slam, which is even better. You can utilize Sigma's off angle to put more consistent pressure out and put basically more damage out. You can utilize your Lucio to force cooldowns. And essentially, like over time, it started to evolve a little bit. People started realizing the power of Reaper flanks and TPs and lurking positions, et cetera, et cetera. And it became very much a who's going to cycle better, right? But also who's going to actually start to control the map better. Because I think you look at this comp, and certainly more so than when it was just Diva, as soon as Sigma started to be released, even if this wasn't a tried and true, this definitely will lose to poke, Sigma shut down a lot of the poke options. Because while Diva definitely provides better answers against things like a pharmacy, more spammier comps that aren't pharmacy, I think Sigma shut down, at least at release, pretty hard. Like, what was it, 1400 or 1500 shield?
Who thought that was okay? But
yeah, I mean, it was just unbelievable. His ability to just control space against anything and everything. And so you run a comp that's the only composition that could really threaten him at the time, which was something that can punch him, something that can shoot him. And I think like this was a meta that was like maybe not the best at the time, but made sense given the circumstances, because this is, I think, another thing to keep in mind why Reinhardt might not have been played is this was before some of his, HP buffs. This was before of his speed buff with taking shield. In other words, pressing W with shield. And most recently, at least with the Doomfist punch and boop, this was before his steadfast buff as well. So he could be booped, displaced very, very easily. So I don't know. I look at this meta and I look at it and like maybe there was something better, but it made sense, especially with, like you were mentioning, the stickiness of the previous Goats meta, that this would be the Brawl that people would go to. Orisa strong, Sig strong, Reaper was very strong, Doomfist maybe not so much, but he was very good in the mirror. Moira was relatively strong, Lucio was still relatively strong, and there you go. I would be hard-pressed to think of heroes that were stronger at the time than Orisa, Sigma, and Reaper.
Unless you do a complete shift. And again, that complete shift becomes we're starting over, we're pulling out what we think are the most valuable heroes because, you've picked out, hey, we think it's Sigma, hey, we think it's this, and we're using these as a support line. Unless you make a hard shift. But again, that stickiness doesn't really allow for that because you're prepping for your tournament next month. You're prepping for your tournament in 2 weeks, etc.
Yeah. Now, one thing I will bring up, and this is something that I have basically no experience with this one at all, because this is when I was not coaching. We were on an off season. Bastion, for a very brief period of time, showed up, even in Overwatch League. And I don't know if I honestly couldn't tell you why. I
Yeah.
understand Bastion in Goats because Bastion was like the only DPS. If you could support him on a certain map, you could technically burn through Goats resources that other DPS couldn't do. But I don't understand Bastion's place here. Do you have any insight here or any guess?
I'm
'Cause I'm
afraid I
open to
don't.
ideas.
I mean, I could make a guess, but I'd just be making a fool of myself putting my foot in the mouth because I really
True.
I wasn't watching much Overwatch League. I really wasn't during that off year. So like I've
Right.
gone back and looked at some stuff, but that what you're talking about was not a long stretch, and I'm pretty confident that I could tear it apart if
Yeah.
I wanted to. Like no one's running
Yeah.
it, but I'm pretty sure if I needed to teach a team how to do it, I could beat it. But, which
Yeah.
maybe I'm wrong, maybe but
Maybe, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was just another symptom of, hey, Brawl heroes are still kind of strong here. Sigma's got too much shield resource. Orisa had Fortifier or
Sure.
HP or whatever was too strong shield. So you're again playing a hero that's trying to bust the Brawl. If you're going to play spam, people said you had to play basically Pharah or Bastion.
Yeah,
or something along those lines.
Hey, double shield. What can try to beat that? And let's go to the same answers that we tried to beat Goats with.
Okay, so then I'm fairly certain that we saw the return of Rein. And this is a meta that actually that sat around for a long time, had a lot of iterations, and I think I'll have a lot of insight in this one because I spent a lot of time coaching this one and not coaching it particularly well. I'd be open to admit. I think we solved it, but we solved it too late. But I think we can talk a lot about it because this is a comp that was largely basically the first, like people kind of started to remember that mirrors are slower spam, but also that there was still the options for teams that were good at it to just W key if they could do it the right way. So what we saw a lot of was Rein. We saw a lot of Diva, some Zarya, but very, very little Zarya. Mei came back. Kree/Reaper. And this is situational. I mean, you could probably guess which one started to dominate as teams got better at going slow.
Yeah.
And then Ana, Lucio, Brig, some Moira, but very rarely.
What brought Mei in? Like, I'm not like shocked, but I'm a little surprised that we're seeing. Go ahead.
Pretty clear what brought Mei in, at least to me, and it's because this is right when I believe they hit Orisa and Sigma pretty hard. They had nerfed Orisa and they had nerfed to Sigma. I think Orisa was hit a little harder. So if you wanted to continue to play Brawl, Orisa Sigma made a lot less sense.
Right.
So when you bring Rein back, and I think maybe this is when Rein's speed buff came back. You guys will have to help me out with this because I don't remember I'm trying to like.
It's a long history for us to remember here. Yeah.
A long history of patch notes here. I can remember the metas, but I don't remember the patch notes that lined up with it. And Rein was probably more viable. And whenever you see Rein in Brawl, you're going to see Mei because she's the hero that enables him to go swing on the enemy Rein, but she also screws him over a lot too. Like Mei is a doom pick for Rein. Like he hates that. So you pick Rein. You're obviously going to go Diva because Diva's going to deny the enemy Mei the most. And Zarya just dies to Mei instantly. And then teams would initially go like the Reaper Lucio because just, hey, rush. Rush. But as people started to slow things down a little bit, at least a lot of teams did, the Kree off angle, the Kree flank, the Kree spam was more valuable. Now this is where things get really interesting. Is teams would play on a Lucio, some teams would play on a Brig on some maps where there wasn't a lot of movement. Which that one never really caught on as much. That was very we saw it every now and then, but very rarely. But there were some teams, most infamously Third Impact in North American Contenders, who ran Lucio Brig, and I mean that's all they ran.
I would hate to be a tank in that scenario, but okay.
So they ran it to such efficiency that they were literally spawn camping Overwatch League teams for months.
Very good. Very good.
So this is probably one of the most dominant teams and contenders, up there with Eagle Gaming for a long period of time. I still have Vietnam flashbacks from scrimming them, and basically I think the way they looked at it is we are just so decisive and so fast.
Sure.
With our core that we will always beat you with just raw teamwork. But the other thing about third impact as well, the way they did things, is they would have so much aggression and discipline from their core
Mm-hmm.
that the McCree, who was Tayo, who's with the San Francisco Shock now,
Right.
legitimately was playing like he was playing Smurfing in bronze. He would be in your spawn.
Sure.
He would be hard flanking across the map, and it
And
was
that
a very much darned if you do, darned if you don't. Either you deal with Tayo, who's literally behind you, or you deal with the Lucio Ryan Brig that are up in your throat, basically.
Yeah, and I think that's something we didn't go into much in Goats. We talked a lot about, hey, it evolves to take angles, etc. But some of those earlier iterations were very much about who can decisively do things together. Like the beginning of those first steps on the ladder were very much that. So if a team is
Yeah.
understanding this is decisively how we do things, we know our strats, we're going to implement our strats, we're all on the same page. Like we really are all on the same page. That's always got a lot of power.
Right, exactly. And another thing that was powerful about it is if you did win first fight, then you have rally and beat,
Yep.
which at the time had a lot more impact than Nano. Nano was easier to deal with.
Is there a time when that's not been true? I'm trying to think. Like
Nanoblade's always good, or
okay,
always has a threat, but that's about it. But I think this comp like fundamentally should have been played in a way that was more slow, that was more supporting. We saw for like a little bit of Overwatch League, the Florida Mayhem were very famous at the time for literally running Brig Kree as a 2-man duo that would go on flanks together. And you can question about like the viability. That was like the on a Brig variant, right? And essentially most teams that were good at it would play very slow. They would play split. They would play, Diva on an off angle, support the McCree. Your Ryan goes in and makes maybe trades off of your Maywall, but nothing committal.
Right.
Whereas teams that were trying to force the hard committal stuff and weren't performing at the third impact did poorly.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's hey, this is maybe the simpler implementation, but you really have to do the simpler implementation perfectly for it to work. Yeah, I hear you.
Right. So it was an interesting composition. Ultimately, I think people got really tired of May. People got really tired of Reaper. So those heroes I do distinctly remember being nerfed. They were tired of seeing it, and once I think at that point May had been nerfed. I think we saw Tracer being buffed again. And I'm trying to remember, chat. You'll have to help me out. I think this is when we started to see. What did we start to see? Now you weren't around here. I want to say this is when we started to see some Brig Zen start to pop up with like Sombra Tracer or Soldier Tracer.
Sure.
I think this is This had some meta stuff. Hang on. Somebody in my chat has linked me something, so I'm going to check this out really fast.
Someone's got a meta history flowchart for us or soming?
Yeah.
Link it to me so I can. Okay, well, if it's good.
I assume it will be all right.
Okay, that's fine.
Let's see here. February 16. All right, it looks interesting. Let me send it to you over
let's do it. Send it to me so I can show my people, which is probably more interesting than the roster of heroes that they've been looking at. Let's open original. Perfect. Okay. Oh yeah, I think I remember seeing this ages ago. Okay. And we've been doing it with sort of everyone's role rather than just saying what the meta is. This is interesting. Okay, let's take a look here.
All right, so I'll let you guys look at it as well. Yeah, this isn't super helpful.
No, I would have liked a little bit more of a, I see it, but I'd like a little bit more of a summary, like where we have our tournament names. I'd have liked we sort of have it. We have on the far right Double Shield, May McCree, but Complete and Utter Chaos. That's only okay.
Yeah, so I mean, it's there. It's something, but I think we've already mostly moved past where it would have been valuable. So I think the idea is that like at this point in time, we've seen Brawl starts to fall out of favor a little bit. And I distinctly remember directly before Brawl. I cannot forget this. Sandwiched between Reaper Doom and the May McCree, we had a very infamous meta, which is like Double Shield.
Yep.
And people call double shield, Reaper Doom, et cetera, et cetera. But when people say double shield, usually what they mean is the Hanzo Mei.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the first iteration we saw of Orisa Sig, basically upgraded ice fishing.
Yep.
And what I guess made Hanzo Mei iconic for me anyway, this was with Vapsin, is that it was the first time, at least, that across the board, not just Overwatch League, but contenders teams as well, everybody was thinking about map control.
Excellent.
Everybody. So we had gotten to a point where people had stopped thinking, oh, we group up as a team, we rush in. That's just how you play the game of Overwatch. And now we have people understanding that Orisa Sigma split, right? Your Hanzo Mei split. Your Bap Zen sometimes split. And the whole concept was, at least for any team that wasn't complete trash, was, your Sigma controls an off angle with Hanzo or Mei support or Bap support, Zen support, etc. And you play around controlling space.
Sure.
And you win or lose based off of that. You don't win or lose.
I don't think that's the first time we've understood that. I think back when we played, we had a very long variation of dive metas, and people did understand that the dive, once you hit the dive, it's a foregone conclusion you're going to win if you've won your staging battle. So I don't think it's the first time in Overwatch we got to that. I just think it's hey, this isn't just a dive thing. This is the game thing.
Right. And if it was an issue in Goats, I think a lot of teams forgot it.
Right.
Because it felt like with Goats, a lot of teams kind of got baited into the Brawl mindset of, like you were saying, like, oh, this only applies to dives. Doesn't apply. Well, no. Now it applies to Overwatch. And we're coming up on a meta where that actually applied to dive as well. People kind of figured that out. So basically the concept, you were basically gone at this point, correct?
Yeah, I was basically gone until we saw our hybrid, we saw the gauntlet, etc. there. So I'm still relatively recent. Yes.
Okay. So basically what this meta was about, like we talked about the splits and the pressure, and it was heavy spam. And the reason why this comp worked is because you've got all these teams that are very set in the Brawl mindset. But Orisa is still strong. Sigma is still strong. Both spam friendly heroes. Hanzo is still strong. Bap is a relatively new hero who puts out a lot of damage. Zen hasn't been touched too much. And Mei was essentially the pick of like, hey, we don't know what else is better. And this hero is pretty annoying to play Brawl into because we can slow you down.
Right.
And the other thing with Mei as well is like, she helped a lot. And if your Sigma is fighting my Sigma for the off angle and my Sigma has a Mei wall, you better be careful.
Right.
That was kind of the idea.
Mei is doing a real good job of going, hey, we're a poke comp, but we're going to keep you honest if you try to run Brawl at us.
Right.
I'm getting it.
Yeah. I do have a question in chat, which I think if you want to talk on briefly, was Clockwork Vendetta ever meta, or was it just a niche strategy? I have my opinion on this, but I want yours.
I don't think Clockwork Vendetta ever fits what we generally think of as meta, simply because what we talk about here is... How do I phrase this? I don't think I'd ever call them meta because what we run into is they're not taking up enough of what's sort of going on. If we're talking about what I'm thinking about, we're talking about back when Clockwork Vendetta was running, back when we were coaching together. Yes, we're not talking about that as some later comp. Okay, yeah, no. I don't think it ever really was because I look at that and go, hey, it happened, but it's not unless you're playing in their specific region against them. It was never a common enough thing that it was really factoring into how you do it. Like again, you can look at any game and sort of be like, hey, this is it, blah, blah. If everyone's playing Clockwork Vendetta, what you want to come out the gate with is different than if everyone is playing Goats or if everyone is playing, Protect the McCree or whatever the case is going to be. Like, you look at that and go, hey, it's not really a factor. Like, it's a factor in that it exists, but it existing on 2% of what's being played is way different than it existing on 60% of what's being played for its impact on the meta, quote unquote. The meta is, again, sort of the outside the game, what are people playing, etc. Well, that has much to do with it. So I'd say no, but what's your opinion?
I agree. I think it was a meta that was designed to counter Goats, by a bunch of people that were good at those individual heroes. And for the most part, it did its job. You've got heavy spam from Torb, Mei, who already discussed, slows down things a lot. Hog, who he found a way to make it work. And obviously Orisa at the time, he was very strong. So I think it was a composition that could beat Goats. I don't think it would have beaten, like everybody says, oh, well, if Goats is properly played, it could have beaten everything. I mean, that's just true. The reason why it worked is because they were just so much better than their counterparts. I think one thing I will give credit to Clockwork Vendetta for is that it did permanently shift people's opinions, along with, if I flatter myself, a little bit of what Phase 2 did. I think it started giving people more open to the fact that Orisa as a hero was still very good.
I think that's true. I think you are there. I think the one advantage that Phase Two's wacky strategies, Clockwork Vendetta, and also, our team in Overwatch League also had as advantages was, hey, there is something to be said for, I find something that's almost as good, but I get to practice against the same thing with 100%
Exactly.
of my practice time, and you don't get to practice against me
Exactly.
ever. So if I can quickly get to a level where I'm competitive with you, it's tough. Yeah.
Right. There's no carryover. You don't. Oh, guys, we're playing against. I remember us scrimmaging Phase 1, who was playing a lot of that stuff, and it was always like, man, we're never going to play against this. Why are we scrimming this? And now it's very much the dilemma that you're talking about. These teams are putting yourself in. If you're Clockwork Vendetta and you're playing against Goats 24/7, excuse me, that's great. But if you're a Goats team, where are you going to find another Clockwork Vendetta?
Well, we saw a
Right.
little bit of that with Sydney Drop Bears even, because we were in a Goats meta, but we had a strong DPS team in our region, and it was like, okay, this is annoying
Yeah.
because we look at this and go, we have to dedicate enough practice time to make sure we can beat this, but
Yes.
they only have to practice against this. Now our comp was
Yeah.
stronger, so it worked out, but it was, it's a bit of a devil's trade that you get stuck in there.
It is. It is. It is. So there, I guess that kind of addresses that question. Um, Double Shield, we talked about it. It was good. It was fine. Did well. Ultimately, once Orisa, I think Sigma were nerfed a little bit. We saw, believe Hanzo was nerfed a little bit, and I think BAP was also nerfed a little bit because this is when Lamp was a little stronger than it was.
Mm-hmm.
I think we saw it regress a little bit. Then we see the McCree kind of come back in, and ultimately after that, I'm doing my best to remember. I believe we had a brief period of time where maybe Double Shield comes back. I want to say that before that, though, we had a meta that was very much Brig Zen, Soldier, Tracer, or Sombra. So it's like either Tracer, Sombra / Soldier. And then I want to say it was either Ball or Sig or like Ball Diva or something like that. Or maybe it was Winston. Either way, like I want to take a point in time. Like there was definitely a Brig plus support plus Tracer comp.
I want to hear more about this because I want
Okay,
to hear what's making Soldier work in this situation. But
now,
I understand the angles, but there's other heroes that do.
Soldier was essentially just, hey, we're playing a relatively mobile comp, and this hero can do pretty well with Brig Armor Pack / Arm, and the Orb, and can take angles. That was basically it. I think Soldier was definitely replaceable and did not last long.
Okay.
What I want to bring more attention to is that the Brig Zen composition, but not just the Brig Zen. We saw Brig with Ana. We saw Brig with Mercy. There was a very popular comp in Europe at this time, run by what was Obey Alliance, what is now Raspberry Racers again, and what was Raspberry Racers back then again. So they were Raspberry Racers, then they were Obey Alliance, and now they're Raspberry Racers. Anyway, and it was running Koth, and it was essentially Pharmacy Tracer, and you ran it with a Brig.
Sure.
And your tanks basically played, I think it was with a Ball, you played very passive, very slow, very cautious, and it was the first time where, not the first time, but it was certainly the first time where more attention had been brought to, hey, Brig is busted at
absolutely, because you're telling me this composition, and it hurts me so much because I think of the original Pharmacy Tracer dive where the struggle was always what support do you run since your Mercy's up there, etc., to make the rest of your team work at all and not just get crushed. And your answer now is of course Brig, because you go, well, you can't catch us and dive us, because I'm thinking what tanks are you running with that, etc. But no, Brig is just breaking it, and she's still broken. But anyway, tangent.
So it was essentially people like that point in time is like, at least in the European and North America region, and contenders, is that we were like, holy cow, this hero, you overpack a Tracer. She's 225 or whatever, 225 HP with armor, and you can pocket your Pharah, you can pocket anything. And a lot of the metas that followed that, and we'll talk about Double Shield's resurgence with this as well, kind of revolved around that concept. Even if I don't remember specifically everything about it, it was Brig pocketing DPS. And it was very much tanks learning how to play more disciplined. Ball starts being picked more often because, hey, Ball doesn't need a lot of healing. We can pocket our DPS and not feel bad about quote unquote wasting armor packs.
Mm-hmm.
And more than anything, the resurgence of reappearance of Brig and the reappearance of mobile DPS.
Right. Wasting armor
Whereas we had
packs is an interesting word for giving a flanker a double strength harmony
right,
orb, but
right, exactly. But you get the idea, and we see pharmacies coming back again. Sombra's coming back again, Tracer's coming back, and even a little bit of soldiers coming back again. And all of this because with the armor pack, this hero just isn't squishy anymore. They can stay in the angle a lot longer. They can stay in that aggressive position.
right.
So
But you've
over
got
time is
the irony,
right. Go
of
ahead.
course, is what originally took down dive is re-enabling the dive heroes, but they still have to deal with that hero on the other team.
Right,
But go ahead.
exactly. So ironically, is like the dive was bad because you
Yes.
still had to deal with Brig, but the signature dive
Mm-hmm.
playstyle of fighting for space way off on sides of the
Mm-hmm.
map was stronger than ever because that was basically it was just Briggs pocketing their DPS and hoping that they would win. And so I think like whether it was Briggs in or Brig Mercy or whatever, like this is what you saw on Koth, this is what you saw on certain maps, and eventually I believe we see May nerfs here, we saw Reaper nerfs, so that Brawl comp is having a harder time sustaining against pocketed DPS. And this is also when we start to see Ashe more often as well, who had been considered underpowered for a long time, had recently received buffs to fire rate, to ammo,
Mm-hmm.
etc., and is now, hey, I'm really strong, y'all better watch out, and now we have Ashe again. So, whether it was introduction of Ball, the buffs to Ashe, Brig being able to pocket DPS, I think at this point in time, Tracer also received her fall off buff. In other words, where she didn't deal with fall off for another extra 3 meters.
I don't think. Oh, did she get another one? Like I
She,
remember a
she
long
did.
time ago when. Wow. So they just
Yeah.
insisted on making her a
So it was like
mid-range hero.
13, 14 meters. Yeah, they reverted it about a month ago. But
I saw the
but yeah,
reversion, but I was
yeah,
thinking like
it
even
was
when Pulse Bomb went down, when Pulse Bomb decreased and stopped being a tank buster, they originally gave her a bit of a range buff. So this was a
I'm
second one that they've since
fairly
reverted.
certain they
Okay,
gave her a second one because
that's
she sees a resurgence. So anyway, she's back and basically pocketed DPS are back, and this is when we start to see heroes that are self-sufficient, map control, dive hybrids, etc.
sure.
Now, this is right when another infamous comp comes in the door, and
Mm-hmm.
this is someone that you're going to be a little bit more familiar with.
Sure.
And this is Orisa Sigma.
Yep.
They come back, they're badder than ever. They're grumpy from all the nerfs. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
But what they're enabled by now is the fact that, hey, we can enable, map control. We can enable map control and still deny your dive because instead of running with BAP Zen, we're going to run it with BAP Brig. And that prevents you from saying, hey,
Yep.
we're going to play, dive into these guys. They got squishy backline. We can just, armor pack or Tracer and she'll farm that BAP Zen. We're going to play BAP Brig. We're going to play BAP Brig and we're going to play it with, Genji. We're going to play it with Ashe. We're going to play it with Tracer. And this is right when Echo was released as well. I know in Overwatch League, there were a lot of teams that were trying to force BAP Zen with Tracer. Or BAP Zen. Like they were basically trying to go back to double shield spam again.
Right.
And there were Tracers like Prophet that were just laughing at their foolishness.
Right, of course.
Because your BAP Zen can't do anything. I remember that was one of the big reviews I did over early last summer was like, look at how much the work this Tracer's getting done.
Yeah.
If you're not running a Brig, your Zen is legit AFK.
Yeah.
Looking for a Tracer. So, we saw a little bit of Hanzo, not as much, but like mostly Ashe, Tracer, and Echo. And a big one was the Genji, the resurgence of Genji, who at that time had also received some significant buffs to fire rate, damage, deflect, cancel, etc.
That certainly hit my radar.
So, what are your thoughts on this composition? I guess before I kind of
I think it's interesting that we're seeing what we've sort of seen a movement away from dive. The original dive did one thing really well, where it's like, hey, we play dive. Dive is the play style. We play for a map control. We use a lot of mobility, and we sync everyone up using this mobility really well to do it. Goats, we're really leaning hard into our brawl, et cetera, et cetera. And I think what we're moving towards is what we're continuing to see, where everything has to be able to if we think of it sort of as a three-way triangle, everything has to be sort of occupying two different spots. And what you're getting into there is
Yes.
you're going really poke heavy, but you have to drop a Briggs in it. You have to have Briggs in
Right.
it, even though she
Right.
does nothing for poke. You have to have her in it, etc. And I think we've
Yeah.
been moving in that where people are getting more of this understanding of, hey, there's sort of three different styles, but these days you've got to occupy two of them.
Right. In other words, the rise of the hybrids,
Mm-hmm.
really, because it's the ability to counter the straight up brawl, the straight up spam, the straight up dive is just one swap away. Um, okay, and I think this is a point in time where we see again the fight for map control, the fight for space. A pocketed tracer can do a lot more spam, prevent your Zen from spamming at all. A pocketed Genji can ruin your entire team's life. Doesn't matter how much damage that you have. He just jumps over the wall, he dashes through you, and then you're completely ruined. And I think we started to see a kind of an interesting hybrid here. So this was an interesting one. So teams played this one very similar to ice fishing. I don't know what it is about Orisa Sigma where teams, I think it's the cooldown of shield and halt. It was a cycling of cooldowns, a cycling of cooldowns, a cycling of cooldowns. And some teams played more split and some teams played more stack. And the reason for that is we saw it was interesting enough, almost more of a brawl spam hybrid than it was a dive spam hybrid. Because a lot of teams would force, do a halt cooldown, Sigma peeks for a rock or whatever, and Tracer goes for a blink, whatever, and
Sure.
you throw some shots at it, whatever, and you go, oh wow, we forced fortify and we forced lamp. I want to punish that now.
Right.
And you'd have the Sigma stacked more the Orisa, shift in or shield in, and the Orisa just goes in. That Brig, they just walk into the enemy team. And they throw lamp in there. And we'd see cooldown trades. Basically, you get a cooldown advantage, and you'd want to push that cooldown advantage. Now, the interesting thing was you always enjoy pushing advantages from angles, not just W keying in, getting concaved.
Right.
But the reasoning why some teams, and I know we did some of this over at Uprising, is we'd off-angle DPS, always off-angle DPS, but Sigma would sometimes stack to enable his Orisa to push the next advantage.
One more time. Sorry, run that last part by me one more time.
So basically, you would utilize Sigma not on an off angle, so that when you did get a cooldown advantage, you could push the cooldown advantage easier because your tanks enabled each other to take space. Because Orisa at that time wasn't really happy with just walking into the enemy team, even with Fortify. So you'd use your Sigma shift, you use your Sigma shield to be able to press W.
So that really comes to me though, like, were we really struggling to just go, hey, instead of just trying to rush forward, etc. Like, I understand, yes, we have more ability to rush forward if our Sigma is stacked on top of our Orisa. What's stopping our Sigma from, sometimes the map geometry doesn't allow it, but I'd imagine most situations your Sigma can just deepen their angle. Like, you can win a fight by going, hey, we're going to push forward and run you over, but you can also just go, we're going to take this a little slower and we've earned a deeper angle, so we're going to have our Sigma take it as we put, and that's going to relieve pressure to push forward.
Right, and that was something that we started to execute more as towards the end of my coaching career, is like knowing when to push, and like when you can push, and how your angles being able to push more aggressively was more important. Now, these heroes are nerfed, and we're getting towards the end, and this is when we get to a really an interesting period of time. Now, I'm coming from EU contenders, but I think at that time, this is when people started to realize that EU is legitimate. Obviously, because I started coaching there, the region instantly just tripled in strength. And we saw double shield maintain. It's like double shield still hung around, off and on. We saw some brawl. So actually, Brawl had a little bit of research. And when I mean Brawl, I mean like the Protect the McCree, Cree May, that would come around. And then very interestingly, for about 1 month, we actually saw Brawl Dive. And this is Winston, Diva, Sombra, Reaper, Moira, Lucio.
Yeah, so... Sorry, Sombra with who? Sombra Reaper? Oh, interesting. So we're running this as a Brawl Dive, and I ran into that when I did an analysis of, I think, the runner-ups on maybe the North American side of Gauntlet. I saw it with Tracer instead of Reaper, and then I saw the other team swap to Reaper. And I wasn't familiar with these. I mean, I'm familiar with Sombra Tracer. I recognize that comp from years ago, etc. And I know how that's executed, but I saw the other team come back with the Reaper. And I look at that and I can go, so what do you like? You're clearly executing it as a brawl, but are people not setting up their angles to dive? Are they really just going, hey, we're a brawl, we're running straight at you? Like, what's the
So
thought here?
basically, this is, I think, double shield or brig or whatever had been hit again.
Mm-hmm.
Typical like Blizzard patch. They did
Mm-hmm.
hit again, and so they fall out of favor. And teams are starting to play Sombra. They're starting to play like Brawly-ish. But basically, what had happened is, whenever Sombra's enabled, you try and play heroes that can survive and deal around her. So
Sure.
you have a meta that kind of forms itself around that, whether it was the best or not, whatever. But you had heroes that basically it was an ironic dive because it was the most undiveable dive that there was.
No, I still think Tracer's less diveable than Reaper, but that's debatable.
Right. So, but still, the idea is there. Now, the way this was played, and we actually, so this is when I was very firmly with Sheercold. I've been with them for about a month at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a reputation for double shield OTPs. And this was, and also the team that choked in trials. So we are choked in contenders. So
Mm-hmm.
I joined on, we'd worked on our mental and performance, and this meta comes around and there's a little bit of moaning and groaning because we're like, oh no, this isn't double shield. We don't know dive. Like Backbone doesn't know how to play Sombra. Shade isn't a good monkey, yada, yada, yada. Well, we crushed it and we came, I think, either in third or fourth place that month because we solved it very quickly. And it was, hey, my Sombra is going to be on an off angle and she's going to stay there. And that's it.
Okay, but why not make your Reaper a Tracer and have your Tracer also on an off angle? Like, I'm still objecting to the concept of this comp.
So the composition worked with your Sombra has an off angle permanently, and your tanks you basically tank trade. You walk in, your Winston places bubble that enables your Sombra to go more aggressive on the angle. You bubble breaks, you matrix, your Winston zap, 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 your Reaper's up in their face, and then you chill out again. And if your Sombra has been able to sustain on the angle, you've built more ult charge, you've put out more pressure, you've maybe gotten a hack that will lead to a kill, and then you just win off of that. The reason teams ran Reaper is because the proximity of this comp, because it had no poke, it ultimately always ended up in melee range. And at least from, we didn't have Overwatch League level Tracers, but from across the board, the entire region, teams couldn't get anything done with Tracer. You'd poke and poke and poke and poke, but against the Sombra, the Diva, the Moira, it was too much of a liability. It was difficult to get pressure done. And Reaper basically, Reaper was basically there, like, you have to matrix. You have to, like, your Winston bubble breaks, et cetera, et cetera. That was basically what Reaper's job was. He just put more pressure in that space, and he didn't die because he also had a shift cooldown.
So I understand he doesn't die because he has a shift cooldown. I understand that the proximity is happening because you guys are running Winstons, which is forcing the proximity to happen. I mean, how hard did people try to break this meta with other things? Because it sounds, I don't know. I look at this and I go, okay, so I see these, etc., but it's got no vertical mobility. So how does it run if we try to play snipers with Brigs against it? You get what I'm saying? Where I'm sort of looking at this and going,
so Tracer was a swap. Tracer was a very, very common swap against any unfriendly compositions. If you played Zen, if you tried to play snipers, you would go Tracer instantly. Reaper was the Doomfist, like of the Arista Sig Doom, right? Like he filled the same role where he was very bad against non-mirror comps.
Sure.
He was good in the mirror, but was instantly you would swap Tracer. And you usually had your hit scan on the Reaper as well, not on the Sombra. So you could make that swap whenever you needed to.
Sure.
And we often did. So
I mean, I can see it. I'm. It's interesting to me that Sombra and Tracer couldn't do a little more poke it out, etc., while you stayed away from them and wore them down. Because Moira does have some sustain issues. That comp has some sustain issues where, hey, if Winston has to use his bubble, he's worthless.
So
go ahead.
The problem with Tracer is the position with which you would want to poke with was difficult to support with the supports that you were running. So you're gonna either number one have to put your Tracer with frontline, which she's just not gonna do much, or she's gonna off angle like she normally would. But who's gonna support her? Moira on the off angle? Like, it was hard enough supporting Sombra on the off angle, which was a priority, much less add a Tracer in the mix as well.
What if you What happens if you swap your Lucio for a Brig? Was it that vulnerable to the other team diving it?
Yes.
Okay.
Because at this point, Brig was at 225, 200 HP for the first iteration. And obviously the lack of mobility, the lack of movement, and more than that, like lacking a boop for the enemy Reaper was worse. Like Boop was better than Bash against enemy Reaper at that point in time.
Right, but you do still have
So you missed the.
you do still have a Moira pouring heals. Like if the Reaper gets on top of your Brig, I agree, and eventually that's going to happen. But I'm thinking, is that worth the trade for being able to sustain your Sombra in their backline longer, sustain your Tracer in the backline longer? Like
I mean,
you
it
are
coulda
still going to
worked.
rotate to get away from them. Interesting. That's fine. I'm
Yeah, it
finding
coulda
tweaks
worked.
that we potentially could have made here.
Sure.
If I'd been around, I'm sure I would have tried, and I'd have found
Sure.
out, oh, this is why it doesn't work, or
Sure.
oh, you guys are all fools. Why didn't you do that? But
Yep.
yeah,
Exactly. But
that's
something
fine.
would have been figured out. The other thing as well is that similarly to with the Orisa BAP, where people would look for a cooldown advantage and push the cooldown advantage, that was the same thing here. You force Monkey. Oh, their Monkey wasted bubble. We go in. And Lucio's speed was extremely useful for that type of basically push, where you didn't have to rely on, hey, our Winston has to jump to push this advantage. We can just amp speed.
Sure.
So that was kind of coincided. We saw some teams playing Brawl, Obey Alliance / Raspberry Racers, like the Brawl a lot. They put Lethal on the McCree, and he would just go hard flank. Hell on Ryan, obviously a lot of good things in Chow and Diva. A lot of different stuff there. One other thing that I will definitely deserves being brought up is this is when we saw the avoided comp come into play. I don't know how much you know about that.
No, I mean we've seen lots of iterations. I remember doing some coaching work with a team called, Avoid List or things like that. Like, I mean, this avoid thing has been a trend in Overwatch, but what was our avoided comp? Spell it out.
So it was basically we are going to play heroes that take the map control away from you because there's so many of us.
So we're going to play Overwatch.
Right. Ball, Diva, Pharmacy, Tracer, Lucio was really generally the other one, interestingly enough. It initially had been like on Zarya with a Pharmacy, but they played us and they lost to us because we were running Winston, Diva, Sombra, Tracer. And we killed their Zarya off of cooldown.
Right.
And we killed their Ana off of cooldown. So what ended up happening is they lost to us, and the next iteration they came back with Diva Lucio. And it literally was just, hi, you can't dive anybody now.
Right, of course.
And they played with Sombra usually as well. And it was just, you can't dive anybody, you can't do anything, we're going to take away the map. And literally just put, our ball's going to roll through, our far's going to fish for rockets, and hopefully something happens. And the Lucio is just going to be a general nuisance. And it's the same thing with the Diva. The Diva Lucio couldn't really do a whole lot.
No, that Diva has to be super
we're just
careful
undiveable. Right, we're undiveable. And the big thing here is that we were very much carried by an exceptional Pharmacy. It's not Yizna. It's I can't remember.
I know
Yizna.
who it is. That's fine.
I cannot remember. I was told how to pronounce his name, but I cannot remember. Yezina or something. And the Ball player, who was Ball Overwatch, who were phenomenal at their roles. And what you lacked in damage, Yezna would make up for direct rockets. And basically the composition was highly mobile, highly fast, played extremely aggressively once they got map control, and basically played to just disrupt whatever. And I think it actually became meta a lot of times in Europe because people were realizing that if you play at a fast enough tempo, if you control enough space, even double shield with Bat Brick struggled into it. Because you have enough heroes that can cause enough disruption that even, it's not just, we have to boop the Monkey with our Brig, or we have Ball, we have Tracer, we have or Tracer or Sombra, we have Pharah, we have Mercy, and we have stupid Lucio, and so it was kind of like too many things to worry about all at once. And infamously, that was almost the first time British Hurricane lost a game. They actually reverse avoided the same month that we beat them.
And I assume they did that with some sort of poke Brawl hybrid. How'd they do that?
I honestly don't remember. I think it was some sort of poke Brawl hybrid, correct? Yeah. But essentially, that was the struggle. I believe this was the same month that Winston, Diva, Sombra, Tracer, or Reaper were meta.
Okay.
It was the same meta. So teams were actually on it, because what would happen is this kind of opened my eyes up to Sombra being a counter to Ball, because people realize that, or Ball Overwatch, I remember I was hearing Backbone screaming in my voice, he's destroyed my translocator again.
Right.
And especially when he's got his own Sombra with him, it's not just, just go Sombra. It was a difficult comp, because they out map controlled Winston, Diva, Sombra, Reaper. But yeah,
Well, I mean, you
basically,
say that, but you've just finished telling me how much map control we mostly didn't take with our Sombra Reaper once it got. Like, I know you put the Sombra on the angle, and I'm with that, but I'm still fighting about that's fine.
true.
That's
And
fine.
it was, well, the comp is just limited by its support lineup, basically. As long as you're running Moira,
Mhm.
Lucio, and not a Brig or an Ana, you're going to be limited with how much space you can control. But
Yes.
anyway, that was basically, and so this is kind of what we saw. Like, we saw a little double shield, and then we'd see some Brawl, and then this comp would make it resurgence, and we go
Mhm.
back to double shield, and then we go back to Brawl, and it was really dependent on the patch shifts, the meta shifts, and for the most part, NA was a lot like this as well. NA had a little bit more of a tendency to play more of the double shield stuff. They liked the double shield. We even saw teams like Odyssey over in NA pull out the Doomfist with the double shield with
Mhm.
Mouthful on Doomfist. So there's a lot of variety with how it was being played. And right about this time, I think, as well as like, on a side note, I think this is when Europe started to kind of pull ahead of NA in terms of overall competency. It's just swapping from meta. They became no longer the GOATs one tricks, but they actually started to pick up heroes and compositions that the NA were slower to pick up as well. And then we finally finish, I think, with the last meta that we'll talk about. I don't really want to talk about double bubble as much. I want to talk about the Brig Zen.
I'm not
And I
sure
think
any of
this is
us are convinced double bubble is meta, but even if it was, there
right,
weren't any
right,
tournaments, and now we have a new patch.
right,
So yeah.
right, right.
Okay.
I've got Nyang in my chat.
Okay.
Do you remember Nyang from Sydney Drop Bears?
Oh
The
yeah.
Korean hits
Okay.
game?
Okay.
Hey, Nyang. Good to see you, mate.
Okay.
But yeah, good to see you, Nyang.
So now, before we move on to this, the Ball Sigma, which that is a comp that I
Yes.
came back, I studied, etc. I'm gonna go a little more in here. So we covered, we certainly covered more metas in this time period that I was gone, that was roughly a year, than we did in previous things, where it's, hey, we're gonna have 9 months of Moth, we're gonna have a year and a half of Dive, we're gonna have a year plus of Goats, etc. So we certainly covered more there. So what do you think led to that? Was that, hey, players know how to play more styles so they can pivot faster? Was that, hey, we did this? Was that, hey, we're covering micro metas when we didn't cover micro metas in previous places, like as Junkrat fell out of favor in place of Widow, things like that? Like, what do you think has led to that? Was it still, hey, there's a hero or two that's sticking above the rest? What do you think was the big driver? I just want to keep this sort of in our
So,
framework.
so in other words, the last couple of months, the
Yeah.
rapid beta shifts.
Yes.
I give me a second to think on this. I definitely think that there were fewer. There was a fewer dominant heroes at that point in time. And once teams had started to play a little double shield, teams had dabbled in the Brig Zen mobile pocket your DPS divey-ish style.
Mm-hmm.
People were less sticky. At least at that point in time, most of the players had played a lot of Goats. They had played the double shield. They had also had experience with ball tracer, a little bit of ball tracer metas towards the end of last spring as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that the stickiness is less there, and that had been sparked because of drastic patch shifts.
Right.
And so then we're also at a point in time that fall, or this past fall and this past summer, where those patch shifts were still rapid, right? They were still rapid. We have an Echo release, we have this nerf, and okay, then that's enabled, and then that's enabled. I think the only hero that you could really argue who was dominant at that point in time, and people didn't realize it, was Echo. Echo was somebody that had not been fully explored, but she was also, number one, a brand new hero who notoriously are never really explored for like generally 6-7 months at least.
Yeah.
And then you look at the meta that you never see Echo played in, and it was Brawl metas where she just obviously can't be played in because it's hard to pocket her.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Winston, Diva, Sombra, Tracer, Moira, Lucio comp, or the Reaper, where it was very difficult for her to play into that. With Diva, Sombra, Hack, Tracer, Moira, Lucio, there wasn't a lot that she could do. And if you were going to buy into that meta at all, how are you pocketing? Again, how are you pocketing your Echo? So I think it was a combination of the strong hero wasn't really fully explored as being as strong as she was, and then the compositions that were swapping around from were very unfriendly to her. So unlike where we saw with like some of the Arista
It was
comps where it's like,
effectively one of these things where we went, hey, we're exploring metas, and even though you think
yeah,
Echo is the strongest pick at this point, people didn't know that, people didn't have it. It would have required a radical paradigm shift, and people
yes,
needed a spark to
yes,
get them there. Yeah, or
and
a
right,
trials team to come up, something,
right, right,
etc.
right. And there was enough creativity with, okay, Sigma is still pretty strong, but Kree is actually pretty strong here too, because fire rate, and this is when we were also dealing with 225 HP towards the end of the meta. And so like over time, this hero was kind of strong. Oh, well, this hero is also kind of strong. And the nice thing about rapid patches is it does lead to a little more guesswork, to where
Sure.
there isn't, like, psychologically players will kind of lean more towards strengths because they really don't know. There isn't that surety that, oh, this hero is definitely strong because everybody plays it. Well, now I don't know.
Right.
So it kind of forces that creativity. And then we have Brig Zen, and I think this was really the pinnacle of the finality of what we talked about, that Raspberry Racers Brig Pharmacy overpack your tracer composition. This was the epitome of that meta, where you're playing arguably the two lowest healing supports in the game combined, around highly mobile, highly spam DPS, and very mobile / very resource dry tanks. Now, you said that you were kind of came back in around this time. Is that true?
I mean, I came back in probably right as this was wrapping up, but it
All
was
right.
relevant enough to study.
Right.
I needed to get my head around the game, so yes, I went and
Right.
studied it. I
Right.
went and did some team coaching. I learned what I had
Right.
to.
So I will talk on it briefly, but then I want you to take it away, because the way I have coached this meta and we had a lot of success with it was with the Briggs End. It was like you're playing with a ball, you're playing with a Sigma, you're playing with tanks that are very, very low resource demand. A lot of people were like, wow, Sigma, he's being picked again. This hero needs to be nerfed. And people didn't really realize that the reason you played Sigma is because you can't play Diva into Ashe, Zen, Echo. You can't play Zarya. You can, but it's not. You don't do a whole lot. You can't play Hog into that. You just bleed ult charge. You just get nuked. So you're playing a very resource light tank, and the entire meta revolved around, well, your big surprise, map control, and it revolved around your ball tracer fighting for angles, fighting for flanks with help of Harmony, with help of Discord. Your Ashe / Echo controlling a sightline, and your Brig pocketing your DPS, again, your DPS, your tanks, whatever needed to control space. Like you could always tell who were the best tracers, or really the best Zens and Brigs, more importantly, because they were the ones not right-clicking at the enemies and across the map. They were not the ones harmoning their Sigma. They were harmoning their ball. They're harmoning their tracer. They're harmoning their Echo, and basically saying, hey, get that Echo out of here. Get that ball out of here. Get the Zen, get the tracer out of here. And they'd win that space. And then once you won that space, then maybe you can dive. Right.
I mean,
maybe you can Discord backline.
We're back to, you have to win the space control to do it. I was a little surprised. I think I heard you packing the tanks, and I certainly wouldn't expect much of that based on how I was studying it, etc. And yeah, I agree. You see these teams that are harmonying their Sigma, or in what was now the last batch trying to harmony their Diva that they were trying to run in the Sigma spot, and it's just like, please stop, please absolutely spend this elsewhere. It was very much about, hey, we have to control this space, and whoever can win this flank battle of the tracer balls is going to do quite a bit, etc. I found it interesting. Personally, I found it a little interesting that we got quite as much Briggs. Like the interesting spot there was always are you running the Briggs or are you running the Mercy? Like that was sort of the most interesting thing that we saw there. We saw teams go both ways on it. I thought that led to some interesting matchups, that those were relatively as strong as each other. Did you ever come out ahead on one that you thought was strictly better than the other?
So a lot of it was map specific, because on maps where you could basically place your Zen in a safe location, you obviously got more value out of the damage boost than armor pack, especially once overpack had been removed. So when it comes to fighting, controlling angles, a damage boosted Echo, a damage boosted Ashe is going to do a lot better than just an armor pack or two. But it was dependent on your Zen either being highly disciplined, highly mechanically skilled, or being set up in a location to where it was very unlikely that he was going to be pressured much. And then if you did run the Mercy, you were very heavily invested in, your ball tracer marking. Don't let them dive. They cannot dive. Whatever you can do, they can't dive, because if they do dive, you lose. But in terms of favorites, No, I didn't really have a favorite. I think
Okay.
it was more situational and specific.
Well, I don't care what your favorite is. I care what you think is best. Come on, man.
I
Come
don't.
on. What do
Right,
I think? What
right,
care what
right.
you like? Your
Oh
preferences
man,
are irrelevant to
I
me.
hate. See, I hate both equally, so I'm refusing to answer.
There you go. There you go. Okay. Okay. Um, yeah, no, I mean, I looked at this. It looked like a reasonable meta to me. It looked competent enough. I have less concerns about some of the other stuff that I looked back and saw. Haven't been as in depth as you were able to, go on some of
Yeah,
this stuff. So that was helpful. But some of the stuff that I kind of looked at, I went, yeah, that's a little squirrely, and I still feel some of it is a little bit squirrely, and there were better things available. I look at this ball sigma that we had and go, this is a reasonable comp. Like, this is balanced enough in what it does. It can do what it does well. But I kind of always felt that way about poke dive. Like, I felt when we
yeah,
had some of the best Overwatch was the, okay, not Soldier Tracer, because Soldier was always a kind of silly pick there, etc. But the pharmacy tracers that we saw on King of the Hill back in the day. Some of the things where it's like, hey, Soldier Tracer at least has enough flexibility to it. The Widow
yeah,
Tracer stuff that we saw. Like, Widow Tracer
yeah.
has always been a, yes, this makes sense. This comp has enough answers. It's actually got a wide enough umbrella to cover the matter. So I
Right,
like this one. I like what I've seen here. I think it makes sense, and it checks all the boxes in terms of
right, right.
being able to play, having good ult economy, etc.
Right. It's a weird one for me because I tend to always transfer my feelings onto others. That's pretty standard human
Mm-hmm.
psychology. But I feel like one of the reasons why this composition found a lot more value than it has in other times is because, at least for me, I started to realize how much pressure a pocketed tracer can do on a harder dive. Um,
On a
Basically,
harder
if I
dive.
harmony,
Go ahead.
right, if I can harmony my tracer, I'm going to make your monkey's job miserable, and your tracer is going to have a really hard time even getting to my zen in the first place. So like we saying, like the hybrid's ability, not just with tracer, but with the tracer with harmony orb, and also with echo, who filled a very similar niche with high damage, high mobility, of just
Mm-hmm.
saying you're never going to be able to engage at full HP no matter what you do. um, so their ability to just basically stunt harder dive meant that you look at this comment like, Zen Mercy, how are they not just diving that off of cooldown? Well, because they can never dive. They never even get
Got
to
it.
that
Okay,
point.
so you're saying Harmony Orb's ability to block harder dive. I was saying, it
True.
sounded like you were talking about Harmony Orb enabling harder dive, like enabling your tracer
No,
to dive
no,
harder, and
that's my
you'd
mistake.
lost me. I'm
My
like,
mistake.
what? Okay.
And when it wasn't just the harmony orb, it was also the DPS, because this is right pre tracer nerf, pre echo
Hmm.
nerf, and to an extent pre ash nerf as well. So you have three very very potent DPS, all, well, at least with echo and tracer, very high mobility, and even ash a decent mobility. So you can't just dive that. You can't just stop that. So they can always stop you from staging, always poke you out from any point in time. Um,
Oh, I don't know
and it
about that.
enabled,
It's not so much that I mean, dive has always been a staging battle, and you're talking about
right,
playing it into mirrors, and like, so
right.
you've never been able to dive because it's always been about, if your Zen is getting crushed in dive, it's because you weren't tank trading effectively, you weren't doing it, or you were making the decision to trade
Right.
backlines.
To an extent, though, but we've never had DPS that tank traded as efficiently as we did with this and do it for free. Tracer at that point in time was at her peak of strength with her
Sure,
fall off
sure.
damage
The
with the force
closest we
bomb.
had
And
was Tracer Soldier. I agree.
right, right. And the difference between Soldier and Echo is that Soldier, while he's poking, is diveable. Echo, while she's poking, is not.
Right.
Um, and that's really the difference there. And that's, I think, the key difference for me is like the lines between, for Echo and Tracer, at least, between dive DPS versus spam DPS started to become blurred.
Well,
I
I
mean,
think
obviously
that's.
Tracer's more dive, but
I
like you have heroes that just had higher damage, higher range
I
than we've
think
seen with that level of
that's a
mobility.
theme that we're coming into, that we've been coming into, where it's the, hey, these heroes that can do multiple things well, that can fulfill multiple sides of the thing. And we made Tracer too poke heavy with, Tracer gets to do too much shepherd
Right,
value. Gets to do too much.
right.
I'm going to shoo you around, and I can actually shoo you around from with cover, not in any
Yeah,
serious amount of threat, without spending a lot of blinks. And like, okay, it's not real heavy poke, but it's meaningful poke. On top of Echo, like, Echo is a fully fledged diver. Like, Echo is a fully
yeah,
fledged diver, a little weak for a diver, but a fully fledged diver with a full poke kit as well, which is just kind of
yeah.
like, okay, we've got that. And then we have, Brig, and we've talked about that is, again, doing two different things at once, etc. We've really done a lot of this in terms of how we're stacking our heroes. So it's been
Right.
interesting, and I think we're going to continue to see that in future metas, which.
And I hope so, because I think while there are the concerns with the power creep and having heroes that are with too loaded kits, I enjoy, as I'm sure you do as well, analyzing and coaching and learning heroes that aren't one dimensional. I think it's just going to be about finding the balance of like how much value does the utility slash hybrid value that this hero has. Um, is it going to be too strong? You look at a hero like Echo. I love the mobility and the damage. I think she's a great design hero, but is it too much damage? Is it too much mobility? Is it having too much of the cake and eating it too? Right. And I think that's the balance discussion and the tricky part for Blizzard anyway.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's definitely the tricky part. I think the answer is yes, by the way, but I think that is the the tricky question. And we'll
Yeah.
be curious to
Yeah.
see where they go. I'll be curious to see if they just go, hey, we're going to do rounds of massive nerfs on everyone so that we can keep, so that when we release powerful heroes, we're not constantly,
Mm-hmm.
like they're going to be releasing heroes that are more powerful than previous heroes. That's going to happen.
Yeah.
I'll just be curious if we get sort of massive nerfs across the board along the way, or
Mm-hmm.
if that's going to have too much of a, oh, I don't like it, I'm leaving type thing. But we'll see.
Right. Right. We
We'll
will
see.
see indeed. So my question, I guess, to kind of wrap this up, because we're up to basically to date. Double Bubble is a composition that
Yeah.
I don't think. Yeah, I don't think that it's going to stick around for too much longer. If it does, I would be surprised. I think Zarya is too much of an anomaly in that comp.
Liability, yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But
There
the
you go.
problem is everything's a liability. But yes, well,
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
not Orisa
So
now.
we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. So yeah, that brings us up to my, I guess, my last question here is I'm looking at the hero cast right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to even try to guess what's the next meta, and I don't think you would either. But what are some heroes that are on your radar in terms of being potentially meta defining, either by their existence or by their absence, I guess?
I mean, I think the heroes, if we look at this and if we look at this by role, we can sort of list out, hey, what are our strongest few heroes right now? And I think I'd actually
Yeah.
be curious if we're on the same page. So I'm looking at the cast and I'm going to start with tanks. And as I look at the tanks, Ball is still on my list even after the boot nerf, and so
Yeah.
is Orisa. I look at those, and those are my two outstanding tanks. Now, those don't work together great, but we've been exploring, hey, more hybrids. There are things you can do with those, etc. So I'm not hammering this out yet, but this is a place that I'd start. And then if I moved on to support, it's obviously going to be, I mean, nothing's changed. You can nerf Discord Orb 5%. It's not changing my opinion on Zenyatta. And then I'd look at Brig as the other hero that's still doing a lot there. We could pick other heroes, but I'm looking at that, as these are still the two nails standing up a little bit. And, I look at damage here, and you're never going to be wrong if you pick Tracer. You're never going to be wrong. I mean, maybe someday you'll be wrong, but you're never going to be wrong if you pick Tracer. And then you sort of get into, okay, well, who's really stuck their head up a little bit above? You could still say an Echo. I'm still split on whether that's still true. You're seeing McCree's getting a lot of ladder value, less organized play value, but he's there.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to list out what I've done here is I've listed out, 4, 5, 6, 7 heroes. I don't think these 7 heroes are going to be played together as the next meta,
Right.
but you look at, go, what gets me 2 of those? What gets me 3 of those? And you start from there. So if I were to look at that, I'd sort of be like, is it the tank line? I mean, Zen Ball's still going to be powerful. Zen Ball Tracer still works. Do I then just run what was the last meta ball comp except stick Orisa in there? Orisa's vulnerable, but if I'm keeping a Brig, maybe that's okay because Orisa's not that vulnerable with the Fortify. Like, that might be a place that you'd start. Or it could be, hey, people are going to try something like this. Let's completely paradigm shift. We've made Orisa powerful, so let's go hard poke. Let's try running, double snipers again, etc. Something along those lines.
Hanzo is still strong.
Hanzo is still very strong. Hanzo could easily be on that list instead of McCree. Maybe he should be. Hanzo, he probably should be, but I'm just, thinking what I've seen, etc. Yeah.
For me, I think tank-wise, I definitely agree with you with Orisa. I think everybody agrees that this Orisa buff is going to be, if there is not, like, the thing with Orisa is she's strong. She's unquestionably strong right now. The question is if she's strong enough to dictate a meta. I don't know that yet. It might be that Brawl just is better or dive hybrids with Ball are still better, but Orisa is unquestionably, the ability to not critical hit on a Fortify is huge. I think Wrecking Ball is still rightfully described as still a strong tank as well. I think Reinhardt is very quietly growing to be quite a strong hero.
He would certainly be a sleeper pick to support something. Like, if you look...
Right. The problem with Brawl that I see right now is that teams have gotten better at beating it. Like, since Goats, like, teams have become smarter. Like, okay, this is like the play style required to, and also sustain metas. Like, in general, with Brawl, like, what are you playing with Brawl? You know, are you playing a Kree? Well, Kree's pretty good right now, so that's fair
Mm-hmm.
enough. But like May's not as strong as she used to be. Reaper's not really a great option either. A lot of the more attractive DPS, like the Tracers and the Echoes, don't go very well with Reinhardt. At least from what we understand right now. Same with Hanzo. So Reinhardt's like a strong hero individually, but he doesn't have a really great cast around him to support that role.
Yeah,
That
I
type
mean,
of play style, at least
there's
right
ways we
now.
could do it. Like you could get something weird like Kree Sombra, and that's not impossible. I'm not saying it's great, but like
Yeah,
I could see something like
true.
that where it's
That's
like,
true.
hey,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but I look at Ryan as a standalone, fairly strong hero right now, just not particularly favored by people that compliment him.
Mm-hmm.
For the support, I think Zen, as long as Tracer and map control and angle control is going to be strong, Zen being able to pocket somebody is going to be really strong.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that, hard for me to say. I don't think really any support stands out to me. I think Moira is just trash, and Moira will. I don't think I'll be surprised if we see
She's training
Moira.
wheels. She's always training wheels. It's
She's training
very
wheels,
rare
exactly.
that she lasts in a meta. I mean, I understand yes, her not being able to beat Hives can give you some cute little tricks, etc. But in the vast
Right.
majority of situations, you can
Yeah.
upgrade to a Zen eventually, or upgrade to.
Right.
Go ahead.
Right, exactly. For damage, I think Echo is still good, but Echo is fairly not fair, but somewhat affected by meta. So if we do see Brawl meta, I don't think we see Echo, even though she might be strong. Ashe is still, I think, decent. Genji's trash, Bastion's trash, Doomfist is trash. Hanzo, I think, is strong. Junkrat is not good. McCree is more of a niche pick, I think. But I think he actually fills his role now. I liked his HP buff. I think if he becomes dominant again, they might want to look at his fire rate again. But I do like the fact that he actually fills the archetype of some form of anti-dive now instead of, hi, this hero is just as squishy as any other hero.
I don't like what it's done to his dueling potential. Like, I'll fight you on that a
That's
little
true.
bit, where I go,
That's true.
hey, he's a little too powerful in individual play, ladder type play, etc., compared to the cast. In organized play, you can crush him with a dive, but he's a little too powerful. Like, okay, I'm going to try to force a one-on-one with this guy with anyone that isn't a sniper. Good luck.
Yeah,
And it's a
that's
little,
true. That's true.
that's not great.
That's true. That's true. For the other heroes, I mean, Sombra is a hero that we just hope is never meta.
Hey, if we want to give health charge back to health packs, I am happy to do the Escameta
No.
all day long. All day long.
No. Oh no. Hey, take damage, guys. Let's do a little charge. Oh gosh. I don't know. Symmetra might be a fun one with Brawl if we see Brawl again. The 25 HP is certainly nothing to sleep on, and her ultimate remains oppressive. But I don't know. She's so very vulnerable. Like, actually, she is a little less vulnerable to dive now, which is kind of an interesting one.
Yeah.
The Tracer one, I think Tracer is going to be, as long as she can be pocketed, she will be good.
Yeah, but again, I think it's like Echo, where she could potentially get forced out. We saw Tracer getting forced into some weird Brawl comps, etc., because she was just that powerful that it wasn't a throw to do so, I noticed. But, we could see a situation. Again, if you look at Orisa and go, maybe Orisa's the new meta-defining thing, and you go, okay, it's going to be a poke, and it's going to be a poke that's resistant to Brawl, so we just give it a little more anti-dive, and we're probably not going to want to Tracer with that. We're probably going to go, hey, let's run McCree Hanzo. I don't want to run that. Let's run McCree Echo. Something like that. We'll see.
True. We also have to remember that Winston got buffed as well. I can't forget Winston. Another 50 armor is significant.
Yeah.
He's been power creep for a while. The HP buff, his damage to armor, the HP buff to his bubble. Exactly. And then the armor as well. So he's been a little power creeped over recently. I mean, I don't complain. I think Winston's my favorite tank, but
he definitely is, but I think Ball still beats him at what's close to his job, and I still don't like running both.
So the awkward thing about Winston right now is like Ball is just better at controlling flanks and angles. Like if I have a Winston Tracer in a flank versus a Ball Tracer in a flank, it's not even close. Like the Ball Tracer is just going to smoke it. And it's just because of the fact that Ball has a gun. Winston's gun has no range. So I'm not saying Winston should have a gun, but he's just in an awkward position to where his space control is mobile, like very mobile, but very short ranged, which is an unusual, I guess, like a little bit of a catch-22. One other thing I want to bring up to note is the Reaper rework, I guess you could say. Now, they did nerf his damage a little bit more on the live patch compared to, so I'm not sure exactly how that like translates out, but it could be interesting to see how that, if Brawl becomes meta again, if Reaper becomes attractive, because Reaper never really was played in Brawl because you could walk up to somebody and one-shot a Reinhardt. Like that just never happened because there was always Boob, there was always Diva. It was because he did decent shield pressure, decent threat from like close to mid ranges, right? So I'm curious to see if we get to like the 5, 7, 8 meter range, if that range buff actually pays off. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm just not
Like,
sure it matters because it's the spread reduction not mattering. Like you've exactly hit it on the head. The spread
that's
reduction
true.
to get that doesn't
That's
matter because
true.
we were breaking shields and we
Because
were
you're hitting shields anyway.
right.
True. But it might matter more if we see like metas where maybe you see try and see Reaper Force into a dive meta where you're shooting monkeys or you're shooting D.Va instead of it. Like unlikely. We only saw that with the Winston Reaper Sombra meta briefly, but it will be interesting to see there because the damage is it's pretty significant. It's pretty significant. But yeah, we will see. It definitely gives them more flexibility, which I think is interesting. But that does it for me. Like a
Okay.
lot of more questions raised and answers given. Yeah. So I guess we just wait and see.
I can live with that approach. I can live with that
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah. I'm not gonna even try to predict metas, man, because like so much of it is like it's like just a dice roll. You have no
Well, it
idea.
doesn't
So
even matter if you're right. It's like this is the right
you know,
meta, and then it's like no, it would have been if anyone had actually trained
yeah,
it, but no one
yeah,
good trained it. So you
yeah,
know,
yeah. It doesn't matter. It
yeah.
doesn't matter. Well, Temporal, I really appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate it especially more because this was completely like
Oh, we had
last
to.
minute.
Yes,
So
yes.
again, for those of you in chat who don't know, Temporal is a good friend of mine, professional Overwatch coach, guest slash content creator, VOD reviewer, ex pro contenders coach, really great guy, knows his stuff. But today we had the plan to do some discussion over like a GM VOD review, and that got quickly thrown out because the patch wiped a replay. So at the last second, we're like, okay, what are we gonna do? Screw it, we'll do some meta analysis. We'll do what makes a meta, and obviously, had a pretty good time. So,
We
Temporal,
definitely did. We definitely
thank
did.
you so much for coming on. I'm still learning from you, it seems.
I think today I got to learn more from you. You got to fill in my history book of hey, what happened a
There you
little
go.
bit more. I mean, I'm
There
gonna
you go.
poke holes
Sure.
on it and say you coached it wrong, but that's just what I do. That's just what I do.
Of course, you're just disagreeable, Temporal. Well, thank you again, man. I really appreciate you coming on, and best of luck with your future content. Chat !guess. Check out his channel. His stuff is really good, and you're putting out a lot of it recently too. Like I honestly can't even keep up with it.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you. I'm trying. I'm trying. We're doing that growth, and it's happening.
All
Okay.
right, man. Well, thank you again for joining me, and you have a good rest of your day, brother.
Thank you. You too, Spilo.
See you, mate.
Bye. Okay, guys, that was Spilo. He's a ex-professional contenders coach. I worked with him on a couple teams. Sydney Drop Bears, Phase 2. He's a good guy. He knows his stuff. I actually really enjoyed working with him. He did a good job of understanding exactly what his role on a team as his role of coach when not everyone did. People would do a very good job of going, oh, stepping all over each other's shoes, et cetera, et cetera. He was always very good with that. But yeah, no, he's great. I do recommend you guys check out his work. His YouTube is Stormcrow Productions. His Twitch, I'll link both of those in the description. But he's a good guy, and that was certainly an interesting one for me. Let me catch up on chat here. So let's take a look. That was our owl chat. We talked about, I think it was always instant. The CD changed. There was never a cast time on it, but I think what we're referring to is, res does still take a little bit of time, even though you don't see a cast bar there. Never got to experience Moth meta. I'm told it was awful. It was a little bit annoying that, again, there's 2 to 3 extra lives on the other side, but the cool thing about it was it did enable a lot, and I mean a lot, of hero diversity compared to metas that came before it. People disliked Goats specifically because it's not what they wanted to play on ladder, and some pros disliked it because they were DPS players, and the scouts simply would not pick someone up for good Briggs or Zarya play if they were trying to pick up a DPS player, because what you're looking at is you're thinking everyone thought, oh, well, Goats is going to end very soon, and it never did, so you couldn't move up during Goats as a DPS player from tier 3 to contenders, from contenders to owl, etc. You couldn't get scouted and pulled up to a better team because no one was willing to rate you just on your Briggs play. Like, you had to have good Briggs play and good DPS play, but they didn't have anything current to look at your DPS play on, and if you played DPS in an official, in a scrim, etc., it didn't really matter. It wasn't like a thing. People weren't practicing it, etc., because they weren't supposed to. Some of them were practicing it, but it's like, oh, it still loses to Goats, etc. So there was issues with it from a player growth perspective in the professional scene. We talked about power creep. Yep, definitely. What do we have? Floats was interesting. I actually really liked the floats thing, and I actually think floats had a similar power level mostly to goats, but it was a harder execution, so it ended up getting used mostly as a counter to the threat of a DPS comp coming out rather than used to battle goats. Someone has Tracer PTSD, terrified and being jumped by that. If he doesn't say I can live with it at some point, we need to depose the imposter. So the thing is, Spilo's pretty good. Like Spilo and I will, I will fight with him, tell him when he's wrong, etc. But Spilo is pretty good, so he's better than most of you plebs. So you're gonna get, how can I say, more criticism from me of your stuff than you're going to get of his stuff. Which is not to say that we don't have mountains and mountains of times where I've just been like, no, you're wrong, etc. And a couple where he's perhaps changed my mind. A couple. I'm not shredding anything. Again, that's because, Spilo has already been built up successfully. Spilo's great. Again, still some things he's wrong on, but hey, I find it interesting. Did we see Ashe in last league? I am not the person to ask on that. Winston should have a weapon. Maybe something. He needs something to make him less bad in the poke stage. I don't know if that's like he's going to have, maybe you give him some shields under his armor so that there's a little bit of health regain. Maybe you give him something. I don't know, but he probably needs something to make him less terrible in the poke phase. But we'll see. Regarding hero balance, what heroes do you think are the example of baseline power? Ooh, that's a great question. Let's take a look here. What's a good example of baseline power right now? Maybe something like, baseline I like is it matters, it's relevant, but it's not overwhelming you. And if I look at that, these are our two most powerful tanks. This was weak, but maybe now it's strong. I can't rate where Winston is anymore. I can't really rate where Orisa is until I see more actual gameplay. And Reinhardt's a little above average, so I'd probably look in my tank line at something like D.Va and Zarya is about where the average is, somewhere in this range for tanks. If I look at that from a DPS perspective, something in like the Sombra world is probably where I think my average is and probably what I'm okay with for power level. I'd personally be okay with the game bringing DPS down to like the Genji level of power, but I'm not going to get my way there. And then in support, I think we have some pretty good support diversity in terms of, hey, our BAP, Ana, those are heroes that are in fine places. Lucio needs a little help, etc. I don't know if I fully answered that for you. I think you're looking for like the most average hero, or I think you're looking at like this. I kind of split it by role here, but I think that's what you're going to get. Rhine meta. It's possible, Brent. I doubt it. I really doubt it. I think people are more likely to see if they can build a meta around that Orisa. That's where the experiments are going to go. And if that doesn't happen, they'll revert to something similar to what they were playing before, and then we'll move from there, etc. But I don't see Rhine. If we looked at Rhine, we see Ryan. Ryan's okay, but he's not. He's above average probably right now, but he's not really a nail that's really sticking up. He would make sense if heroes that worked well with him were also significantly above average. Like if we had a really powerful Zarya, which we don't right now, or if we had McCree's powerful enough, but we sort of run into that who's going to work with him, etc. Lucio is not powerful enough right now. Lucio could still support him if he was overwhelmingly powerful, but Lucio's not overwhelmingly powerful right now. So we hit a bit of a, Moira's not really good, etc. You could if Ana was a bit stronger, but I don't think Ana's strong. I think Ana is a relatively average pick right now, which again, average picks can work just fine, but you're going to want a couple of the high flyers in there. Basically, yeah. Ryan really needs a strong Lucio and mostly vice versa. Mostly vice versa. Like, Lucio is the support that enables Ryan best, and Ryan's going to have a tough time without that speed. Okay. I know, Semitic. Okay, I think that's going to do it. Again, I do recommend you guys go take a look at Stormcrow Productions. I put out a lot of content, and you guys should definitely watch it because it's amazing. But when I'm not streaming, when you guys want more Overwatch stuff, etc., I definitely recommend you check that out, and I'll have a link in the description once this is over. Thanks, guys. Temporal out.